The streetcar dilemma. Choose between saving many lives or a single life. Imagine a bright morning on a quiet suburban street, where the murmur of life continues without change. Birds flutter among the trees, and a gentle breeze stirs the fallen leaves on the sidewalk. Just beyond a row of hedges, the steel rails shine under the soft sunlight, stretching into the distance like two ribbons that lead toward the horizon. It is here, in this tranquil environment, where one of the most disconcerting ethical dilemmas is presented. The streetcar problem. An out-of-control streetcar advances at full speed along the tracks, its wheels hitting rhythmically against the rails. In front, you see a group of 5 workers absorbed in their tasks, unaware of the danger that is coming. There is no time to shout to them. Your gaze goes toward a lever located next to the track, a simple device capable of changing the streetcar's course. If you activate it, the streetcar will deviate toward a secondary track where there is another worker equally unaware of the danger. You find yourself in a moral dilemma. Do you actively intervene and sacrifice a life to save 5, or do you abstain from acting and let destiny follow its course without interference? At first glance, the choice may seem simple. Save the greatest number of people. However, the dilemma is deeper and raises questions about responsibility, intention, and the value of a human life. By pulling the lever, you become an agent of change, deliberately diverting the streetcar and causing the death of a person who otherwise would have been safe. On the contrary, inaction allows the tragedy to occur without your direct influence. But is passivity really innocent when you have the possibility of choice? To understand the complexity of this problem, imagine you are on the platform, with your hand on the lever, feeling your heart accelerate when imagining the consequences of each decision. 5 lives versus 1. The numbers by themselves push you toward a utilitarian perspective, which prioritizes the greatest good for the greatest number. But morality is rarely governed by simple arithmetic. What if the solitary worker is a father, a teacher, or someone who has profoundly influenced the lives of other people? Does that knowledge tip the scale? Consider a variant. Instead of a lever, you are on a pedestrian bridge over the tracks, next to a stranger. The streetcar rushes toward the 5 workers below. This time there's no lever, but if you push the stranger onto the tracks, their weight would stop the streetcar, saving the 5 at the cost of 1. The situation reflects the original dilemma in terms of the result, but differs significantly in moral perception, since directly causing harm through personal action provokes a stronger emotional response and underlines how context shapes our ethical judgments. Philosophers have debated the streetcar problem for decades, delving into the layers of human morality that it reveals. It challenges deontological ethics, which emphasizes the morality of actions in themselves, and utilitarianism, which focuses on the results. Is it justifiable to harm one person for the benefit of many? And if so, where do we draw the line? The parallels with the real world make the dilemma more than an abstract thought experiment. Mental experiment. The programming of autonomous vehicles, for example, raises similar questions. Should an autonomous car swerve to avoid running over a group of pedestrians at the cost of its passengers' safety? Medical triage decisions, military strategies, and public policy options often reflect the same moral calculation implicit in the streetcar problem. Although there may not be a definitive solution, the mental experiment forces us to examine our moral instincts and ethical frameworks, and highlights the tension between emotional reactions and rational deliberation, inviting us to confront uncomfortable truths about responsibility and the value of life. While the rumble of the streetcar resonates in your mind, you are left with the persistent question, what would you do? The simplicity of the scenario contrasts with the profound ethical complexity it contains, reminding us that the most difficult decisions often reside in the gray areas between good and evil, where numbers, intentions, and consequences intertwine in an intricate dance of morality. The organ donor dilemma. Sacrifice one to save several patients. Imagine yourself in the sterile hallway of a bustling hospital, with fluorescent lights casting an intense glow on the polished floor around you, the air buzzing with the sound of monitors, hurried footsteps, and hushed conversations among doctors making critical decisions. You are a brilliant surgeon, known for your experience and high ethical standards. However, today you face a decision unlike any you have faced before. In an operating room lies a healthy person who came in for a routine checkup. In 5 other rooms, patients are on the verge of death, each of them in desperate need of an organ transplant. One needs a heart, another the lungs, and another the kidneys and liver. If you sacrifice the healthy person, you could save the 5 critically ill patients, but should one? At first glance, the moral choice seems distressing. On one hand, there's a single individual living a normal life, completely unaware of the ethical storm looming over them. On the other, 5 lives hang by a thread, each with families waiting for a miracle. From a purely mathematical point of view, saving 5 lives at the cost of one seems logical. More lives preserved means a better outcome, right? However, when the layers of numbers are stripped away and attention is focused on the human aspect, the simplicity of that calculation dissolves into complexity. Consider the principle of consent. The healthy person has not voluntarily offered their organs or agreed to become a sacrificial savior. Their right to life, autonomy, and bodily integrity are pillars of modern ethics. By taking their organs by force, that fundamental principle would be violated and a precedent would be set that could erode trust in medical institutions. Imagine the chaos that would ensue if people began to fear routine checkups for fear of being considered organ donors against their will. However, the plight of the 5 patients cannot be ignored. Each person waiting for an organ has hopes, dreams, and loved ones who would be devastated by their loss. Their families watch over their bodies, whispering prayers in waiting rooms, clinging to the slightest hope that a donor will appear in time. The weight of those expectations weighs like an invisible burden. Saving 5 lives could mean granting 5 families the joy of reunion and the relief of renewed hope. Philosophers usually approach this dilemma from different ethical standpoints. Utilitarianism, which seeks the greatest good for most people, could advocate sacrificing one to save 5. It focuses on the results and maximizing general well-being. However, deontological ethics, based on duties and norms, would argue that taking an innocent life is intrinsically wrong, regardless of potential benefits. Finally, there is virtue ethics, which asks what a wise, just, and compassionate person would do in this situation. Which perspective seems most correct to you? Imagine yourself in the patient's place. You go to the doctor expecting a favorable diagnosis and face an unimaginable betrayal. Or put yourself in the place of one of the 5 patients who cling to hope with each breath. The dilemma is not reduced to a question of numbers, but to the value we give to human dignity and rights, and how far we will go to save lives. Real-world scenarios sometimes reflect this dilemma in organ donation policies. For example, the debate between express consent and opt-out systems raises questions about consent and social responsibility. Some countries automatically enroll citizens as potential donors unless they explicitly refuse, with the aim of increasing donation rates and saving lives. Others rely on voluntary participation, respecting individual autonomy, but often face shortages that cost lives. Both approaches face the delicate balance between personal rights and collective good. There is also the broader question of fairness. Should one life be weighed against many? What if the only healthy person was a renowned scientist about to make a revolutionary discovery or a parent with young children? Conversely, what if the 5 patients had led lives marked by harmful decisions or criminal acts? Do their past actions influence the value of saving them? These questions go round and round without offering easy answers. Then there is the disturbing idea of what the application of such a decision would mean for society. If sacrificing individuals for the common good became acceptable, where would the line be drawn? Could governments justify extracting organs from marginalized groups or those considered less valuable? History has shown the dangers of dehumanizing individuals for supposed collective benefits. The slippery slope looms, warning us against seemingly logical but morally treacherous paths. Ultimately, The organ donor dilemma forces us to confront our core values. Do we prioritize the collective over the individual? Can the ends justify the means? How do we navigate the murky waters where morality, legality, and human emotions collide? Standing in a hospital hallway, with the clock ticking and lives depending on your choice, what would you decide? The answer may not be clear, but the questions persist, challenging us to examine what it truly means to value human life. The lifeboat dilemma, deciding who survives when resources are scarce. Imagine a vast expanse of ocean that stretches endlessly in all directions. The horizon is painted with orange and pink hues as the sun dips below the waves. In the midst of this serene backdrop, a lifeboat drifts aimlessly. It is a small boat built to carry a limited number of people safely, but now it carries far more than it should. Water hits its sides, threatening to flood the boat with each passing wave. The faces of those on board reflect weariness, fear, and desperate hope of being rescued. The lifeboat dilemma places you in this situation, with too many passengers and the boat about to capsize. What should be done? Should some be thrown overboard to save the majority, or should everyone remain on board, risking everyone's lives? This moral dilemma is as chilling as the ocean air that brushes the skin of those clinging to the sides of the boat. Imagine a situation in which the lifeboat is designed to carry 10 people, but there are 15 on board. The weight overloads it, causing it to sink more with each passing minute. If no action is taken, the boat will soon capsize, submerging everyone in the icy depths. However, deciding who should be sacrificed gives rise to a cascade of disturbing questions. Should decisions be made based on age, health, or social value? Is it right to prioritize the young over the old, the strong over the weak, or those who depend on others over those who are alone? The moral landscape is as turbulent as the ocean itself. Let's explore a real-world analogy in the world. In 1943, the British ship HMS Laconia was sunk, and the survivors faced a similar dilemma to that of the lifeboats. Crowded ships forced difficult decisions. Some had to be rejected, while others clung to the sides until their strength failed them. In modern contexts, this dilemma echoes emergency triage situations in which limited resources force life-and-death decisions. Philosophers have long debated how to navigate these ethical dilemmas. Utilitarianism, which advocates for actions that maximize general happiness, could argue that sacrificing a few to save many is justified, but deontological ethics, which focuses on duties and norms, would maintain that deliberately harming others is morally inadmissible, regardless of outcome. Let's imagine that we are the person holding the rope, and we are faced with the decision to cut it or risk the lives of everyone. The weight of that choice is heavier than any wave. Let's consider another perspective. What would happen if they volunteered to be thrown into the sea to save the others? Would the voluntary nature of their sacrifice absolve the group of guilt or highlight the profound moral responsibility that falls upon everyone involved? The dilemma also raises questions about leadership and decision-making. Should the captain make the decision, or should it be a collective one? Does a vote make the decision fairer, or simply spread the burden of guilt? The lifeboat dilemma goes beyond literal lifeboats and reflects the challenges faced in resource allocation, environmental policies, and humanitarian crises. For example, during food shortages, deciding who receives help often involves similar ethical dilemmas. How do we balance fairness, need, and long-term consequences? In the field of healthcare, transplant lists pose similar dilemmas. Organs are limited and must be allocated, which inevitably leaves some without a chance at survival. Philosophical reflections on the lifeboat dilemma reveal our deepest values and the complexity of moral reasoning. Some argue that doing nothing and letting nature take its course eliminates personal responsibility. Others claim that action, although tragic, is a moral imperative to avoid greater losses. Let's imagine the silence that occurs in the lifeboat after a decision. The immensity of the ocean seems to judge each choice, indifferent to human suffering. By examining this dilemma, we confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, justice, and survival. The calm after the storm may bring physical relief, but the psychological weight of the decisions made in desperation lasts long after rescue. These thought experiments force us to deal with the essence of morality when survival is at stake. Game. How do we measure the value of a life? Can sacrificing a few for the good of many truly be justified? As the stars begin to cover the sky above the lifeboat, casting a silver glow on the rippling sea, the questions remain unanswered, floating in the air with the same weightlessness as the waves rocking the boat. These dilemmas offer no easy answers or promise of comfort. Instead, they challenge us to confront the depths of our moral compass and the decisions we hope we never have to face in the vast and unpredictable sea of life. The problem of AI and autonomous cars, programming ethical decisions into machines. Imagine yourself in the distant future in Noto, sitting comfortably in an autonomous vehicle gliding down a bustling city street, with pedestrians strolling along the sidewalks, cyclists zigzagging through traffic, and the hum of electric motors filling air. Your car, guided solely by artificial intelligence, navigates with remarkable precision until, suddenly, the unexpected happens. A child darts onto the road chasing a ball, while on the other side a group of elderly pedestrians enters a crosswalk. The car's AI has milliseconds to decide: swerve and risk the safety of the occupants, continue forward endangering the child, or turn toward the pedestrians. This scenario summarizes the essence of the problem of AI and autonomous cars, a modern adaptation of the classic trolley dilemma. Unlike the trolley dilemma, which places the decision directly in the hands of a human, the AI dilemma shifts responsibility to programming engineers, ethicists, and policymakers who face a profound question. How should a machine be programmed to value human lives? Should the vehicle prioritize the safety of its passengers, the number of lives saved, or perhaps the most vulnerable people involved? Some argue that programming cars to minimize overall harm, sacrificing fewer lives in favor of more, aligns with utilitarian ethics. Let's imagine a situation in which swerving avoids hitting 5 people, but endangers a single passenger. Should the car be designed to value numbers above all? This approach, while seemingly logical, raises disturbing implications. Would potential buyers avoid vehicles that could sacrifice them for the greater good? Could it influence people's willingness to adopt autonomous driving technology if personal safety is not guaranteed? Conversely, others advocate for programming that prioritizes passengers, ensuring that the car's occupants are always protected. This perspective emphasizes individual responsibility. Passengers choose to travel in the vehicle, so it must serve their interests. However, what happens when this stance leads to avoidable tragedies for pedestrians and other road users? This is a moral dilemma in which every decision benefits some while harming others. Cultural differences further complicate the issue. Studies show that people from different countries prioritize different ethical principles. In some societies, the protection of young people may take precedence, while others may emphasize respect for elders or the protection of law-abiding citizens from those who cross the street recklessly. Should AI systems cater to regional values, or is it necessary to establish universal ethical standards? If the latter is chosen, whose morality defines them beyond the theoretical lies of the predictability of pragmatic obstacles? Suppose all cars prioritize pedestrians. Could malicious people take advantage of this by entering the roadway, knowing that cars would stop? Conversely, if cars systematically favor occupants, pedestrian safety could decrease, making urban environments less walkable and safe. These unintended consequences reveal the complexity of translating ethics into code. A proposed solution involves transparency and choice. Manufacturers could offer customizable ethical configurations that allow users to select their moral preferences. However, this introduces new ethical dilemmas. Should individuals have the right to decide whose life their vehicle values more? Could these choices lead to social inequalities in which wealthier users opt for self-preservation configurations while others bear the consequences? Legal responsibility also becomes very important after a fatal accident. Who is responsible? the programmer, the manufacturer, the car's owner, or the AI itself. To establish clear responsibility is fundamental, but difficult too. To make the engineers responsible for all the possible scenarios could slow down the innovation, while blaming the AI, an entity without conscience, raises philosophical and legal paradoxes. While the technological advances accelerate the race of the regulatory organisms to catch up, the international collaborations strive to establish guidelines. But the consensus turns out to be difficult to reach. To balance the security, the morality, and the public acceptance is not a simple task. As autonomous cars approach generalized adoption, society faces a collective decision. What values must be incorporated into our machines? To reflect on previous dilemmas, like the problem of the tram or the dilemma of the lifeboat, reveals a common thread: the fight between the individual and the collective well-being. However, the problem of the AI and the autonomous cars differs in a fundamental aspect. Its implications are no longer theoretical. These decisions are being programmed nowadays in the vehicles, with real consequences that are developing in the streets. Around the world, as you reflect on this dilemma, consider the wider implications. Beyond the roads, autonomous systems extend to the healthcare, military, and financial sectors, each presenting ethical dilemmas. The way in which we approach these decisions now can determine the future of the relations between the human beings and the machines during generations. Ultimately, the problem of the AI and the autonomous cars challenges us to face the limits of the technology and the morality. Can a machine truly make an ethical decision, or are we simply projecting human values into lines of code? The answers remain difficult to find, but the questions become more urgent with each kilometer that we travel on the road towards the autonomy. The whistleblower's dilemma: loyalty to an employer versus the denunciation of irregularities. Imagine an office in a skyscraper bathed by the golden light of the afternoon, where a single figure remains long after the majority of the employees have picked up their things. On the table is a report full of numbers, graphics, and a heartbreaking discovery. The person flips through the pages, heart beating fast with the weight of a decision that could alter countless lives. This is the essence of the dilemma of the whistleblower and the ethical enigma in which the personal loyalty, the legal consequences, and the moral responsibility collide. Imagine you work for a company that has been part of your life for years. Your colleagues have become friends, the management team has invested in your growth, and your work provides economic security for you and your family. One day you discover evidence of serious irregularities. It could be that the company is pouring dangerous waste into a local river, falsifying the accounts to deceive the investors or sell defective products that endanger lives. The discovery leaves you at a crossroads. Should you denounce the irregularities, risking your career, your reputation, and possibly even your safety? Or should you remain silent, preserving your livelihood, but allowing the improper conduct to continue? The denunciation of irregularities often presents conflicting loyalties. On one hand, there is the duty to defend the truth and protect the general public. On the other, there is the loyalty towards the work colleagues, the supervisors, and the organization that pays you the salary. To speak could give rise to reprisals, to a descent of category, to legal battles, or to the inclusion in a blacklist of the sector. However, the silence could weigh heavily on the conscience of one's conscience, especially if the irregularity causes damage. What is the right way to act when both options have significant consequences? Let's consider the real case of Chiron Watkins, the executive of Enron that denounced the accounting fraud of the company at the beginning of the decade of 2000. Her decision to speak out revealed a massive corporate scandal, but also subjected her to public scrutiny and complicated her career. Or let's think about Edward Snowden, whose revelation of classified surveillance programs unleashed a global debate about privacy and national security. His actions were hailed as heroic by some and condemned as treason by others. These examples highlight the complexity of the dilemma of the whistleblowers, in which the ethical clarity is often obscured by the personal risk and the public opinion. Let's examine this from a utilitarian perspective. which suggests that the most ethical option is the one that gives rise to the greatest good for the greatest number. If denouncing corruption saves lives or avoids widespread harm, doesn't that compensate for the personal costs? However, from a deontological point of view, one could argue that the loyalty and the fulfillment of the promises are moral imperatives. If you have signed a confidentiality agreement, don't you have an obligation to respect it? These opposing ethical frameworks complicate what might otherwise seem a simple decision, adding another layer of complexity. Cultural and legal factors play a key role in this dilemma. In some countries, the solid protections to the whistleblowers encourage the people to take a step forward. In others, to denounce can entail severe sanctions or even prison sentences. The legal systems vary, as do social attitudes. In certain corporate environments, denouncing irregularities is considered a betrayal. In others, it is applauded as an act of courage. These variations highlight that the dilemma is not only personal or ethical, but that it is also deeply rooted in the social structures. From a philosophical point of view, the whistleblower's dilemma raises questions of integrity and courage. What does it mean to be a person of principle? Is it more courageous to risk personal losses for the common good? Or is it more sensible to protect oneself and loved ones? Imagine yourself before a closed door, behind which the truth hides, waiting to be revealed. Opening it could unleash unpredictable consequences, but leaving it closed allows the harm to persist. With what choice could you live? The crux of this dilemma lies in that disturbing question. The analogies to the real world further illustrate the complexity of the panorama. On a boat in which you discover a structural defect that could cause it to sink, reporting it could delay the trip and incur enormous costs, which would bother the passengers and crew. Ignoring it could maintain calm now, but cause a catastrophe later. Or imagine that you work for a pharmaceutical company that rushes to get a medicine to the market. You discover that the tests have been insufficient and that human lives are being put in danger. Reporting it would slow down the benefits and the jobs, but keeping silent could endanger the patients of the patients. Both scenarios force you to weigh immediate consequences and long-term effects. Beyond individual consequences, reporting irregularities often triggers broader social debates. When irregularities are exposed, it can give rise to systemic reforms protecting future generations. But what happens if the whistleblower's motivations are questioned? The critics could argue that he acted out of personal revenge and not out of moral conviction. This skepticism can cloud public perception and add another layer of complexity to an already tangled network. When reflecting on the dilemma of a whistleblower, one has to deal with opposing values. Honesty versus loyalty, survival instinct versus altruism, short-term stability versus long-term justice. There is rarely a clear answer. Each choice carries its own burdens and rewards, shaped by personal beliefs, cultural norms, and the particularities of the situation. So, if you found that report under the golden light of your office, knowing what you know and understanding the risks, what would you do then? Would you raise your voice to challenge the injustice? Or would you silently close the folder, convincing yourself that someone else will take care of it in the end? The dilemma of the whistleblower is not only about what is right or wrong, but about what you are willing to defend when there is a lot at stake. The dilemma of lying to protect. Is lying justifiable to avoid harm? Imagine a cold winter night where a father embraces his son to protect him from truths that could shatter his world. Now expand this simple image to a broader context. A friend covers up for another to avoid harm. A doctor offers a hopeful prognosis to encourage a patient, or a diplomat hides information to maintain a fragile peace. The dilemma of lying to protect raises a timeless and challenging question. Is it morally acceptable to lie if the deception serves to avoid harm or achieve a greater good? Let's imagine a woman named Sarah living in an oppressive regime. One night, government agents knock on her door, looking for her neighbor David, who is hiding due to unfair persecution. Sarah knows the truth. If she lies, she risks being punished if she is discovered, but telling the truth condemns an innocent man. Her decision is debated between honesty, a virtue often defended as a moral absolute, and a compassionate desire to protect another person from harm. In that silent pause before answering, the weight of countless ethical debates looms throughout history over her. Philosophers have struggled with this dilemma for a long time. Immanuel Kant, a deontologist, believes lying is always wrong, regardless of circumstance. For him, moral norms must be universal. If everyone lied when it suited them, trust would erode completely. On the contrary, utilitarians like John Stuart Mill argue that the morality of lying depends on the consequences. If a falsehood leads to greater happiness or less suffering, is it not the kindest option? At this crossroads of thoughts, we see a head-on clash between moral principles and pragmatic compassion. Let's consider an example. A doctor faces a terminally ill patient who asks, "Will I recover?" The truth is raw, but a reassuring answer could give the patient peace in his last days. Does kindness justify misrepresenting truth, or should honesty prevail to respect the patient's right to know? Similar dilemmas arise when parents protect their children from harsh reality, or when friends offer comfort with half-truths to avoid mutual pain. History reveals moments where lying to protect has been praised. During the Second World War, countless people risked their lives to hide persecuted refugees, often by lying to the authorities. Their deception saved lives, transforming lying, normally condemned, into an emblem of moral courage. However, the dilemma worsens when considering long-term consequences. Lies, even well-intentioned, can crumble trust when revealed, raising the question of whether temporary protection is worth future betrayal. This puzzle is not limited to individuals. Governments and organizations debate between transparency and secrecy. Should a government reveal information that could cause panic or hide the truth to maintain order? The choice between honesty and deception resonates in international relations, healthcare, and life. Let's imagine a scenario where your lie saves someone from danger, but later causes unforeseen harm. A false testimony can save a friend today, but undermine justice tomorrow. These complexities highlight the balance between compassion and responsibility. At the heart of the dilemma of lying to protect lies a profound tension between two moral instincts: the impulse to be sincere and the desire to protect others from harm. While honesty fosters trust, compassion drives us to consider the feelings and safety of those affected. Navigating this ethical labyrinth requires not only abstract reasoning, but also a deep understanding of context, intentions, and possible outcomes. In the last instance, this dilemma invites us to reflect on our values. Is truth an inviolable principle, or does goodness sometimes deserve moral commitment? Perhaps the answer lies not in an absolute rule, but in reflective discernment that weighs the unique complexities of each situation. As you reflect on this question, think about the stories you have told, whether you protected comfort or forgave, and the question that remained: was the decision correct? Ethical dilemmas like this challenge us to look beyond black and white answers, urging us to accept the nuances of human morality. In that gray space where truth and compassion intertwine, we face the profound complexities of what it means to do the right thing. The controversy over animal experimentation balances human benefit and animal suffering. Imagine entering a gleaming research laboratory where the air vibrates with anticipation and the slight smell of disinfectant lingers on spotless countertops. There are rows of glass vials whose contents shine under the fluorescent lights. In one corner, a cage houses a small white rabbit whose nose twitches with curiosity and fear. Researchers dressed in lab coats prepare to inject the animal with a new compound. Their faces show a mixture of determination and hesitation. This moment encapsulates the essence of the animal experimentation controversy, a debate that has raged for decades, pitting scientific progress against ethical responsibility. Proponents of animal experimentation argue that it has been instrumental in many of humanity's greatest medical advances. Vaccines against diseases such as polio, measles, and hepatitis were developed with the help of animal models. Procedures such as organ transplants, cancer treatments, and even life-saving drugs owe their existence to these tests. Its advocates argue that sacrificing a few animals to save millions of human lives is a worthwhile sacrifice. Without animal experimentation, they argue, medical advances could be dangerously delayed, putting entire populations at risk. On the other side of the debate are those who consider animal experimentation an unjustifiable cruelty. For them, the pain, fear, and confusion experienced by laboratory animals cannot be morally justified. Imagine being subjected to repeated injections, forced to inhale toxic gases, or kept in cages without understanding their suffering. Critics argue that, in an era of technological innovation, alternatives such as computer simulations, organ-on-a-chip technology, and advanced cell cultures offer humane options without compromising scientific progress. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of this controversy lies in the balance between need and compassion. Imagine a parent watching their child struggle with a terminal illness. Wouldn't you support any measure that could offer hope, even if it involves animal experimentation? Now, share that with the perspective of an animal rights activist standing in front of a lab with a sign that reads, "Their lives matter too." Both perspectives stem from deeply human emotions: love, empathy, and the desire to alleviate suffering. However, they reach opposite conclusions. Consider the story of a pharmaceutical company developing a breakthrough drug to combat a rare neurological disorder. The compound shows promise in early cell studies, but requires animal testing before human trials can begin. Rabbits and mice are subjected to high doses, and some suffer serious side effects. Critics condemn the experiments as barbaric, while patients desperate for a cure see them as a ray of hope. This clash of priorities highlights the ethical dilemma faced by scientists, torn between advancing medicine and respecting animal welfare. Adding to the complexity of the debate is the global disparity in regulations. Some countries enforce strict guidelines to minimize animal suffering, requiring thorough justification and humane treatment. Others, however, operate with a lack of oversight, leading to widespread abuses. This inconsistency raises the question of whether there should be a universal ethical standard for animal testing. If so, who decides where to draw the line between necessary research and unnecessary cruelty? Philosophers and ethicists have long debated these issues. Utilitarian thinkers argue that actions should aim for the greatest good for the greatest number of people. According to this logic, if animal testing saves countless human lives, it is morally permissible. Deontologists, however, argue that certain actions, such as causing harm, are intrinsically wrong, regardless of outcome. This ethical tug-of-war forces society to confront uncomfortable truths about the value we place on different forms of life. Real-world examples further complicate the issue. Cosmetic animal testing, often criticized as non-essential, has been banned in several countries due to public outcry. However, in some regions it remains a common practice. Medical trials, although generally more accepted, remain subject to scrutiny, especially when alternative methods exist. The tension lies in defining what constitutes a necessary use of animal experimentation. Is it only for life-saving treatments, or does it also include improving quality of life, such as developing drugs for arthritis? Then there is the cultural dimension. In certain societies, animals are revered and protected, while in others they are seen primarily as resources. This cultural perspective shapes communities' views of animal experimentation, influencing laws, consumer behavior, and public opinion. This raises a poignant question. Are our ethical standards determined by objective morality, or are they a reflection of cultural norms and personal biases? Technological advances offer a ray of hope to bridge this ethical gap. Innovations such as 3D printed organs and artificial intelligence simulations promise to reduce, if not eliminate, the need for animals in research. However, these technologies are still in the development phase and may not be able to completely replace the complexity of living organisms. Meanwhile, researchers face a constant dilemma. how to keep advancing scientific discovery without compromising their moral compass. The controversy over animal experimentation ultimately forces us to examine our values. Do we prioritize human progress at all costs, or expand our circle of compassion to include other sentient beings? There are no easy answers, only difficult decisions reflecting the complexity of modern science and ethics. As society continues to grapple with this issue, one thing remains clear. The debate must continue, driven by empathy, reason, and an unwavering commitment to do what is right, even when the way forward is unclear. The debate about cultural appropriation. Where is the line between appreciation and exploitation? Imagine a great festival unfolding under a sky painted with vibrant twilight hues. Music fills the air, laughter spreads through the crowd, and people dressed in colorful attire dance to the rhythm of melodies that have crossed continents. In the midst of a celebration, you observe someone wearing a traditional headdress from a culture very different from their own. Their attire elicits both admiration and criticism, triggering a whirlwind of conversations. This scene embodies the core of the debate on cultural appropriation, a complex dilemma in navigating the thin line between appreciation and exploitation. Cultural appropriation occurs when people adopt elements of a culture that is not their own, often without understanding or respecting its meaning. This becomes especially controversial when the culture that borrows has more power or privilege, while the culture of origin has historically suffered marginalization or oppression. The debate intensifies when symbols deeply rooted in tradition, spirituality, or identity are commercialized or trivialized. Consider a common example. A fashion designer presents a collection inspired by indigenous patterns and garments. At first glance, it seems like a tribute to a rich cultural heritage, but critics argue that profiting from designs without involving or compensating the communities from which they come transforms admiration into exploitation. Imagine a sacred textile pattern passed down from generation to generation being reproduced to manufacture mass-produced accessories for those who appreciate these traditions. For them, these actions may seem like an act of erasure rather than honor. On the other hand, advocates of cultural exchange argue that sharing traditions fosters understanding and unity. Cultures have borrowed and mixed. There is no form of art, cuisine, or language that exists in total isolation. A chef who is inspired by global flavors or a musician who incorporates foreign instruments may genuinely seek to celebrate diversity. But the question remains, where does respectful exchange end and harmful appropriation begin? To further explore this dilemma, imagine an artist who paints the Myral girls inspired by traditional Aboriginal art without consulting the community. Their intention may come from admiration, but Aboriginal art often has spiritual meanings and stories that are not intended for public dissemination. Public dissemination without consent. The work of art runs the risk of distorting or disrespecting those narratives. In contrast, collaborative projects in which communities actively participate, receive credit, and compensation transform potential appropriation into mutual appreciation. Reflect on how cultural appropriation intersects with power dynamics. When dominant cultures commodify the symbols of marginalized groups, they can perpetuate historical injustices. Traditional hairstyles, clothing, or religious symbols may be considered fashionable among celebrities while being stigmatized in people of the culture of origin. This disparity underscores the importance of context and sensitivity. Globalization adds another layer of complexity. Travel and digital connectivity expose people to diverse traditions, making intercultural influence almost inevitable. Wearing a kimono at a Japanese tea ceremony as part of cultural immersion differs greatly from wearing it at a party without understanding its meaning. The former embodies a respectful commitment, while the latter risks reducing culture to a mere aesthetic. Is sufficient intention to justify cultural borrowing? Many argue that even well-intentioned actions can cause harm if they ignore historical context or the voices of those affected. Others argue that strict borders can stifle cultural evolution and connection. This tension highlights the need for continuous dialogue, empathy, and awareness. The debate on cultural appropriation invites us to reflect on deeper questions. How can we honor the richness of global traditions without overshadowing those to whom they belong? What responsibilities do creators, consumers, and institutions have in promoting respectful cultural exchange? Addressing these issues requires not only awareness, but also actively listening to marginalized voices. Real-world examples further illustrate the nuances. Yoga, rooted in ancient Indian philosophy, has been commercialized in ways that strip away its spiritual aspects. While some welcome the global popularity of yoga as cultural diffusion, others call for recognition of its origin and preservation of its deeper meanings. Similarly, the popularity of certain hairstyles or garments outside their cultural context often sparks debates about privilege and double standards. Ultimately, the path to respectful cultural engagement depends on intention, context, and collaboration. Appreciating a culture involves learning its history, recognizing its struggles, and elevating its voices. By fostering curiosity along with humility, people can celebrate diversity while honoring the integrity of the cultures they encounter. When reflecting on the cultural appropriation debate, consider the domino effect of your choices. Wearing a symbol or practicing a tradition carries stories that go beyond aesthetics. Those stories deserve to be heard, understood, and respected. As we embrace the beauty of global cultures, let us do so with empathy, awareness, and a genuine desire to connect rather than consume. The question of capital punishment. Should the state have the right to take a life? Imagine a court bathed in cold fluorescent light, where the air is charged with tension, the judge's gavel resonates in the silent room, and a person's destiny hangs by a thread. At the center of this solemn moment is one of the most polarizing ethical questions of our time. Should society have the right to take a life as punishment for a crime? The debate about capital punishment or the death penalty is not only a question of law, but of morality, justice, and human rights. Supporters of capital punishment often argue from the point of view of justice and deterrence. Let's imagine a scenario in which someone commits an especially heinous crime, such as a premeditated murder that devastates families and communities. In these cases, defenders believe that the death penalty is a necessary form of retribution, an eye for an eye, which guarantees that the perpetrator pays the highest price. They argue that knowing such punishment exists could deter others from committing similar crimes. Let's consider a busy highway where speeding fines are severe. Drivers tend to slow down to avoid punishment. Similarly, defenders claim that the mere existence of capital punishment can prevent potential criminals from acting on violent impulses. On the other hand, detractors question this reasoning with compelling moral and practical arguments. One of the most powerful arguments against the death penalty is the risk of executing an innocent person. History reveals numerous cases in which people were sentenced to death and exonerated years later thanks to new evidence or advances in forensic science. Imagine spending decades behind bars for a crime you did not commit, knowing that each appeal could be your last chance. For critics, even a single unjust execution is an unacceptable failure of justice. Another point of contention is whether capital punishment really serves as an effective deterrent. Studies carried out in various countries and legal systems have yielded contradictory results, with some suggesting that there are no significant differences in crime rates between regions with and without the death penalty. Let's imagine two neighboring cities. One applies the death penalty for serious crimes, while the other imposes life imprisonment without parole. Surprisingly, crime rates in both cities remain similar, which calls into question the hypothesis that fear of execution deters criminals more effectively than long-term imprisonment. Ethical considerations are sharpened. The dilemma is whether it is morally justifiable to respond to violence with state-sanctioned murder. Critics argue that doing so undermines the very principles of human dignity and compassion that a just society must uphold. They point out that life imprisonment allows options for rehabilitation and repentance, which are permanently closed by the execution. From this perspective, taking a life, even that of a criminal, perpetuates the cycle of violence instead of resolving it. Cultural and social values also influence how people view capital punishment. In some cultures, retribution is considered a crucial element of justice, while others emphasize forgiveness and restorative practices. Let's consider the case of Japan, where the death penalty is applied, but public debate about it remains moderate, in contrast to many European countries that have completely abolished this practice, citing human rights grounds. Concerns. This global division highlights how ethics are often determined by history, tradition, and collective values. Practical factors also play an important role. Death penalty cases are notoriously expensive, requiring lengthy trials, numerous appeals, and enhanced security measures. These costs often exceed those of sentencing a person to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, raising questions about the best use of public resources. Could funds be better allocated to crime prevention programs, victim support services, or improving prison conditions? From a philosophical point of view, the debate invites us to reflect on the fundamental purpose of punishment. Should it be about retribution, deterrence, rehabilitation, or the protection of society? If the goal is to make society safer, some argue that life imprisonment achieves this without the moral and ethical complexities of execution. Others argue that certain crimes are so heinous that only the death penalty provides a sense of closure and justice to the families of victims. Personal stories further humanize the issue. Some family members of victims find comfort in the execution of the perpetrator, as they believe it offers them closure. Others, however, claim that the long legal process associated with capital punishment only prolongs their pain and prevents healing. On the other hand, listening to those sentenced to death who express sincere remorse can provoke reflection on the capacity for change even in those who have committed heinous acts. As technology evolves, the ethical landscape continues to change. Advances in DNA testing have reduced the chances of wrongful convictions, but have also revealed past errors, leading some to reconsider the finality of the death penalty. In addition, international human rights organizations are increasingly pressuring countries to abolish this practice, emphasizing that justice should never cost a person's life. The question of capital punishment ultimately challenges us to find a balance between justice and mercy, punishment and compassion, and the safety of society and individual rights. There are no easy answers, only a complex web of considerations that force us to examine what kind of society we want. Should justice be measured by retribution or by our capacity for forgiveness and understanding? Each point of view has its weight, leading us to grapple with the profound implications of deciding whether life itself should be subject to human judgment. The debate between privacy and security. How much privacy should be sacrificed for security? Imagine walking through a busy city square with cameras mounted on tall light poles silently following your every move, while your phone's GPS records your location as you stop for coffee, look for a bookstore, and meet a friend at home. You browse social networks and only see ads tailored to your recent conversations. This is the modern world, where convenience and security are balanced with personal privacy. But where should the line be drawn? This question lies at the heart of the debate between privacy and security, a controversy that has captivated policymakers, technologists, and citizens alike. Imagine a government trying to prevent a terrorist attack by accessing large amounts of data, emails, phone records, and travel records. The authorities could detect suspicious patterns that might save lives. However, to collect this information, they must spy on millions of innocent people's private lives. This dilemma raises a crucial question. Should the right to personal privacy be sacrificed for the sake of collective security? Let's consider the consequences from world events. After the September 11th attacks, many countries expanded surveillance to combating terrorism. In Estados Unidos, the Patriot Act granted authorities broad powers to monitor all communications. Proponents of these measures argued that they were vital to national security, but critics warned that such surveillance violated civil liberties and created opportunities for abuse. Revelations by whistleblowers like Edward Snowden intensified these concerns by exposing programs that collected enormous amounts of data without public knowledge or consent. Beyond governmental surveillance, technology companies have also become key players in this debate. Smartphones, social media platforms, and search engines collect and store large amounts of user data. Companies argue that this information improves the user experience, increases security, and drives innovation. However, data breaches and the unethical use of personal information, such as the Cambridge Analytica scandal, have sparked widespread distrust. How much should companies know about their users? And who holds them accountable when privacy is compromised? The tension between privacy and security is not limited to governments and companies, but reaches into everyday life. Imagine installing a smart home device that listens for emergencies, but also captures private conversations, or think of facial recognition software that identifies criminals, but could also misidentify innocent people or be used to monitor dissidents. These technologies promise security, but carry the risk of eroding fundamental freedoms. Different cultures and legal systems address this balance in various ways. European countries, through regulations such as the General Data Protection Regulation, RGPD, emphasize privacy as a fundamental human right. In contrast, other nations prioritize security and implement comprehensive surveillance with limited oversight. These contrasting approaches reflect different social values and histories, but all face the same essential dilemma. From a philosophical point of view, the debate invites deep reflection. Is it acceptable to infringe individual privacy to protect the majority? Some argue that those who have nothing to hide have nothing to fear, as they believe that security should take priority. Others argue that privacy is essential for human dignity, freedom of thought, and protection against tyranny. Without privacy, they argue, democracy itself may be in danger. Technology continues to outpace legislation, making the debate between privacy and security even more urgent. Artificial intelligence, biometric data, and interconnected devices pose new challenges and possibilities. Finding the right balance requires well-thought-out policies, public participation, and continuous scrutiny. Solutions could include transparent oversight mechanisms, clear consent protocols, and safeguards against misuse. Imagine yourself at a crossroads where one path leads to greater security with ubiquitous surveillance, and the other to robust privacy, but with potentially greater vulnerability. Neither option is without consequences. Society must navigate this complex landscape by weighing the costs and benefits of each decision. As technology evolves, so must our understanding of what we value most: the security of the collective or the freedom of the individual. The debate between privacy and security remains unresolved, but it forces us to ask essential questions about the kind of world we want to live in, how much we are willing to sacrifice to feel safe, and whether we can achieve both privacy and security without compromising either. These questions, challenging and profound, demand careful consideration as technology continues to shape our lives. The ethics of genetic engineering. Should human beings alter nature at a genetic level? Let us imagine a future in which scientists can alter the very structure of life, in which diseases are eradicated before birth, crops resist the harshest climates, and human longevity extends beyond what we once thought possible. This is not the plot of a distant science fiction novel, but the reality that genetic engineering highlights with the power to rewrite DNA. Humanity stands on the threshold of unprecedented possibilities and equally profound ethical challenges. Genetic engineering involves modifying the genes of organisms to achieve desired traits. In agriculture, it has revolutionized food production. Crops such as corn and soybeans have been modified to resist pests and tolerate herbicides, increasing yields and reducing agricultural costs. However, questions arise. Should we manipulate nature to such an extent? What are the long-term consequences of consuming genetically modified organisms? Some argue that this technology guarantees food security for millions of people, while critics worry about potential environmental damage and unforeseen health effects. The ethical debate intensifies when it comes to human genetic engineering. Technologies like CRISPR have opened the doors to correcting genetic disorders. Imagine preventing diseases like cystic fibrosis or Huntington's disease before a child is born. For families affected by hereditary diseases, this possibility seems like a miracle. However, when science goes beyond disease prevention and delves into improvements such as selecting height, intelligence, or eye color, the waters become murky. Should parents have the right to design their children? Is there not a risk of creating a gap between those who can afford genetic enhancements and those who cannot, which could exacerbate social inequalities? Let us consider the hypothetical medical case of a couple that wants to design their unborn child to have superior cognitive abilities. Although their intentions stem from the desire for the best for their child, this decision could set a precedent. If intelligence becomes something that can be bought, will society value people differently based on their genetic modifications? This raises the specter of a future in which natural human diversity is diminished and replaced by a standard of perfection. Genetic engineering of animals adds another layer to the ethical puzzle. Scientists have developed pigs that produce organs suitable for human transplants, which could potentially save countless lives. However, altering animals for human benefit raises concerns regarding animal welfare. Are we crossing moral boundaries by manipulating living beings to satisfy human needs? Some argue that if it alleviates human suffering, the benefits can justify the means. Others argue that such practices can modify life in a worrying way. Environmental impacts simply cannot be ignored. Genetically modified crops can cross-pollinate with wild plants, which could alter entire ecosystems. For example, a genetically modified plant designed to resist certain pests could inadvertently harm beneficial insects or lead to the emergence of herbicide-resistant superweeds. It is essential to balance technological advancement with ecological responsibility and care. Religious and cultural perspectives further complicate this ethical landscape. Many traditions consider life sacred and believe that altering genetic material interferes with natural or divine processes. Others argue that using technology to alleviate suffering aligns with humanity's responsibility to improve life. Navigating these diverse points of view requires thoughtful dialogue and respect for different beliefs held. A fundamental question then arises: who decides the limits of genetic engineering? Governments, scientists, and ethicists debate regulations, but public opinion remains absolutely vital. Transparent debates involving diverse voices can help shape policies that reflect collective values, not just the interests of a few. Historically, scientific advances have often outpaced ethical considerations and thought. The development of nuclear energy, for example, brought with it both a revolutionary way to generate energy and also devastating weapons. Genetic engineering has similar potential, which can be incredibly beneficial or deeply harmful to society. Learning from past innovations underscores the importance of foresight and caution in development. From a philosophical point of view, this forces us to confront what it truly means to be human. If we can eliminate flaws and enhance strengths, do we lose something essential to our very nature? Human experiences, joy, struggle, and growth are intertwined with imperfections in life. By striving for genetic perfection, we risk erasing the traits that foster resilience, empathy, and individuality in people. There is also the important question of unintended consequences. Even with rigorous testing, altering DNA could produce unforeseen effects that might appear generations later. The complexity of genetic systems means that changing one gene could influence multiple traits in unpredictable ways now. The responsible use of this technology demands humility and recognition of our limited understanding in the world. Access to genetic engineering technologies remains unequal. Wealthy nations and individuals can benefit greatly, while others are left behind, exacerbating global disparities now. Efforts to ensure equitable access must be part of the debate so that advances do not widen existing gaps instead of reducing them. While genetic engineering offers extraordinary opportunities, it also invites deep reflection and thought. At this moment, when society is at a crossroads, it is essential to deliberate carefully and balance innovation with ethics, progress with caution, and benefits balanced with risks. This will ultimately determine the legacy we leave to future generations to come. Will we be able to exercise this power responsibly, or will the allure of possibilities overshadow wisdom and moderation now? The answer lies in the decisions we make today as we navigate the intricate terrain of genetic engineering now. Ethics, the dilemma within the just war theory. When is war morally justifiable to all? Throughout history, humanity has grappled with the complexities of war, its causes, its conduct, and its consequences overall. Among these reflections is the just war theory, an ethical framework intended to discern when it is morally permissible to wage a war and how conflicts should be conducted overall. Rooted in the philosophies of thinkers such as Augustine of Hippo and Thomas Aquinas, this theory has evolved over the centuries, influencing both moral philosophy and international law. However, despite its structure and guidelines, the theory opens the door to profound ethical questions that challenge even the most rational minds today. Let us imagine a nation that faces an aggressive neighbor that threatens to invade it soon. The immediate reaction might be to defend itself, but questions immediately arise. Is the conflict truly justified? Could diplomatic avenues effectively avoid bloodshed? In essence, the just war theory attempts to answer these dilemmas through two main categories: the ius ad bellum, the right to go to war, and the ius in bello, the right to conduct during war. Each category establishes the conditions that must be met, but applying them to real situations is far from simple. For a war to be considered just, it must satisfy several criteria. First, according to the jus ad bellum, there is the principle of just cause. War should only be waged to address a serious grievance, such as defending against aggression or preventing massive human rights violations. Next comes legitimate authority. The decision to wage war must be made by a recognized governing body. This is followed by the correct intention, which emphasizes that the purpose must be to ensure a just peace, rather than seeking revenge or economic gain. Another criterion is proportionality, which requires that the expected benefits of war outweigh the anticipated damages. Finally, there must be a reasonable chance of success, and war must be the last resort, only after all peaceful options have been exhausted. However, meeting these conditions in practice poses significant challenges. Let's consider the 2003 Iraq War. Some argued that it met the just cause requirement, as its goal was to disarm the alleged weapons of mass destruction and end tyranny. However, critics argued that the intelligence was flawed, the intentions were mixed, and diplomatic solutions had not been fully explored. This debate exemplifies how subjective the interpretations of the criteria can be and how politics can cloud ethical judgment. Beyond the decision to go to war, there is the equally important question of conduct, which is governed by jus in bello. Two principles stand out: discrimination and proportionality. Discrimination requires that combatants distinguish between military targets and non-combatants, ensuring that no deliberate harm is caused to civilians. Proportionality in conduct ensures that the force used is adequate to achieve legitimate military objectives without causing excessive destruction. In modern warfare, where conflicts often involve drones, cyber attacks, and asymmetrical tactics, adhering to these principles becomes increasingly complex. Imagine a military commander who must decide whether to attack a building believed to house enemy forces. Intelligence suggests that there may be civilians present. If the attack is carried out, delaying it could allow the enemy to regroup, endangering the lives of soldiers, but acting could lead to civilian casualties. These decisions embody the core ethical struggle of just war theory, which balances moral responsibility with the brutal reality of war. The advent of new technologies and forms of conflict introduces additional complications. Autonomous weapons and artificial intelligence challenge traditional notions of responsibility. If a drone malfunctions and causes unintended casualties, who is held responsible? The operator, the military command, or the engineers. Similarly, the intangible nature of cyber warfare raises questions about what constitutes an act of war and how to respond proportionately. The advent of new technologies and forms of conflict introduces additional complications. Autonomous weapons and artificial intelligence challenge traditional notions of responsibility. If a drone malfunctions and causes unintended casualties, who is responsible? The operator, the military command, or the engineers? Similarly, the intangible nature of cyber warfare raises questions about what constitutes an act of war and how to respond proportionately. Critics argue that just war theory, despite its noble intentions, can be manipulated to justify almost any military action. Governments can frame aggressive policies as humanitarian interventions or claim defensive motives to mass territorial ambitions. This misuse dilutes the moral clarity of the theory and risks normalizing violence under the guise of ethics. Conversely, its defenders argue that, without such a framework, the moral discourse of war would be eroded, leaving decisions in the hands of brute power and opportunism. The theory's emphasis on intentionality, responsibility, and humanity offers at least a moral compass in a realm often devoid of ethical references. From a philosophical point of view, just war theory invites reflection on the very nature of violence and justice. Is it truly moral to take lives, even in defense of others? How can peace arise from intrinsically destructive actions? These questions have no easy answers, but they force societies to confront the weight of their decisions. International bodies, such as the United Nations, attempt to apply aspects of the theory in global governance, although effectiveness varies. While resolutions and treaties seek to limit unjust wars, geopolitical realities often undermine these efforts. Powerful nations can circumvent protocols by claiming self-defense or national interest, challenging the ideal of universal ethical norms. Despite its flaws and limitations, just war theory endures because it strives to humanize one of humanity's darkest endeavors. It recognizes that, while war may sometimes be inevitable, it should never be undertaken lightly or waged without respect for human dignity. By demanding rigorous scrutiny of motives and methods, the theory urges caution and responsibility when contemplating war. One remembers that ethics in war is not about finding perfect solutions. It is about dealing with impossible choices and striving to find the least harmful path. When leaders decide the fate of millions, these ancient principles resonate in their deliberations, reminding them and us that, even in the midst of conflict, conscience must never be silenced. The conflict between corporate responsibility, profits, and environmental and social obligations. Image of a city's bustling skyline, with its towers shining under the morning sun. Within these corporate giants, decisions are made that impact economies, communities, and the environment. Among the many questions executives face, one stands out. How far should a company go to balance profits with social and environmental responsibility? This conflict, known as the corporate responsibility dilemma, raises a crucial question. Should companies focus solely on maximizing shareholder value, or should they extend their duty to employees, customers, local communities, and the environment? Historically, the concept of corporate responsibility was straightforward. In the mid-20th century, economist Milton Friedman stated that the main duty is to its shareholders. According to his point of view, as long as a company operates within the limits of the law, its ultimate goal should be to increase profits. This perspective simplified corporate decision-making but left out broader social concerns. However, as the world has become more interconnected, the ramifications of this limited approach have become increasingly clear. Consider a global clothing manufacturer that outsources production to countries with lower labor costs. From a financial perspective, the decision reduces expenses and increases profits. However, reports emerge revealing poor working conditions and unfair wages at these factories. Consumers and human rights activists express outrage and demand accountability. The company faces a dilemma: maintain low costs and risk public backlash, or improve working conditions, which could increase production costs and reduce profit margins. Environmental concerns further complicate this issue. Imagine an energy company contemplating drilling in a region rich in oil, but that also houses endangered species and indigenous communities. The potential financial gains are immense, promising substantial returns for investors. But local residents fear ecological destruction and cultural displacement. Should the company move forward in the name of profits, or should it honor its broader responsibility to preserve the environment and respect human rights? Some companies strive to adopt what is known as the triple bottom line: people, planet, and profits, prioritizing sustainability and ethical practices. These companies aim to create value long-term, beyond immediate economic gain. For example, technology companies that invest in renewable energy sources reduce their carbon footprint while improving their public image. Although these initiatives are often costly at first, they can foster customer loyalty and attract socially conscious investors. However, not all attempts at corporate responsibility are authentic. Greenwashing, the practice of promoting an environmentally friendly image without taking substantial measures, has become a growing concern. Imagine a beverage company that boasts of recyclable packaging while its factories pollute nearby rivers. These contradictions highlight the complexity of assessing true corporate responsibility. How can consumers and regulators distinguish sincere efforts from marketing ploys? Globalization adds another layer to this conflict. Multinational companies operate in diverse cultural and legal environments, where ethical standards may vary greatly. In one country, strict environmental regulations force companies to innovate cleaner technologies in another. The lack of oversight can tempt companies to cut corners for higher profits. Navigating these discrepancies requires not only compliance with laws, but a deeper commitment to universal ethical principles. The debate intensifies when technological advances are taken into account. Social media platforms, for example, face the challenge of balancing freedom of expression and content moderation. Should they prioritize growth and user engagement, or should they invest more resources in preventing the spread of misinformation? Each choice has implications for public trust and corporate credibility. Public pressure and consumer activism have undoubtedly changed corporate strategies. Decades ago, ethical considerations were often secondary to profits. Today, viral campaigns and boycotts can force companies to reconsider harmful practices. However, doubts remain about the authenticity of these changes. Do companies act out of genuine concern, or are they simply responding to market demands? Employees also play a key role. Many workers now expect their employers to reflect their personal values. A young professional may reject a well-paid job at a company considered unethical and opt for one committed to social good. This shift in workplace priorities challenges traditional corporate structures and urges leaders to rethink their long-term goals. Legal frameworks further complicate the landscape. Corporate laws in many countries emphasize the interests of shareholders, making it difficult for companies to prioritize broader social concerns. Some jurisdictions have introduced legislation requiring companies to consider environmental and social impact, but its enforcement remains inconsistent. How can global standards evolve to ensure accountability while respecting national sovereignty? This conflict raises broader philosophical questions about the nature of responsibility. Should companies, as collective entities, have moral obligations similar to those of individuals? Can profits and ethics truly coexist, or are they fundamentally incompatible? These questions lead us to reflect on the kind of world we want to build through our economic systems. Historical examples offer both cautionary tales and sources of hope. Oil spills, financial scandals, and labor abuses demonstrate the consequences of unchecked corporate greed. Conversely, companies that have adopted responsible practices often inspire changes throughout the sector. The challenge consists in discerning which paths lead to genuine progress. Consumers have considerable power in this equation, since by choosing to support companies that align with their values, individuals can drive the demand for ethical products and services, but not everyone has the privilege of prioritizing ethics over affordability. Is it fair to expect consumers to assume this responsibility, Or should systemic changes come from the business world? Regulation, innovation, and public awareness continue to shape this constantly evolving landscape. Governments can apply stricter laws, but companies often move more quickly than legislation. Innovative solutions, such as transparent supply chains and independent audits, offer possible paths to advance, but tensions persist between economic growth and ethical responsibility. Ultimately, the issue of corporate responsibility challenges us to redefine success in business. Should profits be the only criterion for measuring a company's achievements, or should the well-being of people and the planet play an equally important role? Navigating this dilemma requires courage, creativity, and a willingness to address uncomfortable questions. When reflecting on this complex issue, one thing becomes clear: corporate decisions do not exist in a vacuum, but shape the world in which we live, influencing everything from local communities to global ecosystems. As stakeholders in this interconnected network, we are all part of the debate about what companies owe society and what society expects in return. The debate on euthanasia and assisted suicide, the ethics of choosing death. A person lies in a hospital bed, surrounded by the hum of machines and the silent rustling of nurses. Their body is fragile, worn down by months of relentless pain. Family members gather, holding hands, with eyes full of mixed emotions: pain, love, and confusion. In the midst of this emotional whirlwind, a difficult question arises. Should people have the right to end their suffering through euthanasia or assisted suicide? This dilemma raises powerful arguments on both sides, forcing society to face the delicate balance between compassion, autonomy, and the sanctity of life. Euthanasia involves a medical professional actively ending a patient's life to alleviate suffering, often at the patient's request. Assisted suicide differs slightly. The patient administers lethal medications provided by a doctor. Advocates argue that these acts represent the highest form of mercy, as they prevent people from prolonged agony and give them control over their final moments. However, detractors raise concerns about the moral implications, potential abuses, and the message it sends to society about life's value. Let's imagine a woman named Margaret who is battling an aggressive form of cancer. Despite the best medical treatments, her days are filled with unbearable pain. She expresses a clear desire to end her suffering peacefully. Her family, divided between respecting her autonomy and clinging to hope, is torn between the decision to grant her request. Is it an act of kindness, or does it cross an ethical line? Margaret's story is not unique, but it encapsulates the deeply personal nature of this debate. Supporters of euthanasia and assisted suicide often invoke the principle of autonomy, the idea that people should have the right to make decisions about their own body and life. They argue that, just as people can reject treatments that keep them alive, they should also be able to choose a dignified end to intolerable suffering. Some point to jurisdictions such as the Netherlands, Belgium, and certain states in the USA, where these practices are legal under strict regulations. Data from these regions suggest that legalizing assisted dying can prevent secret and unsafe attempts and provide comprehensive safeguards. However, detractors raise profound ethical and philosophical concerns. They are concerned that the normalization of euthanasia could pressure vulnerable people, such as the elderly, disabled, or those with economic burdens, to choose death out of a perceived obligation. There is also the fear of a slippery slope in which the criteria could gradually expand beyond terminal illnesses to include chronic conditions or psychological suffering. Religious perspectives often emphasize that life is sacred and that ending it, even with good intentions, usurps a realm beyond human authority. Let's consider a contrary scenario. David, a young man with a serious but non-terminal disability, feels discouraged and requests assisted suicide. Should society respect his request? Critics argue that, instead of facilitating death, resources should be focused on improving care, mental health support, and quality of life. They warn that laws must be drafted with extreme care to avoid unintended consequences. The historical context adds another layer to this complex debate. Throughout history, various cultures have held divergent opinions on death and autonomy. In ancient Greece, for example, some philosophers supported voluntary death under certain conditions, while others condemned it. Current technological advances in medicine further complicate the issue by prolonging life in ways unimaginable to previous generations, but sometimes at the cost of prolonged suffering. Legal perspectives also vary greatly. Some countries, such as Switzerland, allow assisted suicide in specific circumstances, while others, such as Japan, maintain strict prohibitions. The legalization of these practices often involves rigorous processes, multiple medical opinions, psychological evaluations, waiting periods, and documented consent. Even with these safeguards, questions persist. Can consent be completely free from external pressures? How can we ensure that laws protect the most vulnerable while respecting individual freedoms? The emotional dimension of this debate cannot be underestimated. Families, medical professionals, and patients often face a labyrinth of conflicting feelings: love, fear, guilt, and compassion. Doctors face their own dilemmas, trying to balance their oath to do no harm with a desire to alleviate suffering. Some healthcare professionals accept the role of helping to a quiet end, while others refuse for moral reasons, highlighting the complexity of personal convictions. This debate also affects the changing role of medicine. Is it solely about prolonging life, or does it also encompass the quality and dignity of that life? Technological advances have blurred lines between natural death and medically prolonged existence. As medicine advances, society must grapple with these questions, considering both technological possibilities and ethical limits. The cultural differences that shape perspectives cannot be ignored. In some cultures, enduring suffering is considered noble or spiritually significant, while others prioritize personal autonomy and minimizing of pain. Global debates often reveal how deeply rooted are the values and traditions that influence ethical viewpoints. Ultimately, the debate on euthanasia and assisted suicide challenges us to reflect on what it means to live and to die with dignity. It pushes us to consider the weight of suffering, the limits of autonomy, and the responsibilities we have towards each other. While legal frameworks and ethical arguments provide a structure, at the heart of this issue lies a deeply human question: how do we balance compassion with caution, individual rights with social values? Margaret's family, like many others facing this decision, finds no easy answers, only the hope of making the most compassionate choice possible. As society continues to navigate this difficult terrain, ongoing dialogue, empathy, and reflection remain essential. The question of the ethics of child labor, cultural norms versus universal human rights. Image of a bustling market at dawn, where the air is imbued with the aroma of spices and chatter of early risers. In the midst of the crowd, a child no more than 10 years old carries a sack almost twice his size. His hands are calloused, his face stained with dust, and his eyes, though young, reflect the weariness of someone who has endured responsibilities far beyond his years. This scene, though disturbing, is a reality in many parts of the world. The ethical dilemma forces us to face uncomfortable questions. Is it justifiable for children to work? Where do we draw the line between necessity and exploitation? Child labor is often seen through a binary lens. It is either totally condemnable or a necessary evil in impoverished regions. Those who oppose it argue that childhood should be a time of education and play, not of work. Children who work are deprived of schooling, education for development, and are vulnerable to physical and psychological harm in industries such as mining, agriculture, and textiles. Children face dangerous conditions that adults themselves have difficulty enduring. The idea of a child handling sharp tools or breathing toxic gases is distressing. These situations highlight the urgency of global efforts to eradicate exploitative child labor. However, the question is far from black and white. In some communities, the income that children bring home is vital for the survival of their families. Eliminating this income source without offering an alternative can plunge families into even greater poverty. Let's imagine a rural family that depends on their children's wages to buy food, medicine, or a roof. Without that contribution, they could face hunger or homelessness. Herein lies the ethical dilemma. Is it more harmful to impose general prohibitions on child labor without addressing the underlying economic disparities that drive it? The cultural context further complicates the issue. In certain societies, helping in family businesses or on farms is considered a rite of passage rather than exploitation. A child who helps with the harvest after school may be acquiring valuable life skills without necessarily being exploited. It is essential to distinguish between harmful work and acceptable forms of labor. The International Labor Organization, ILO, distinguishes between child work, which may be permissible under safe and non-harmful conditions, and child labor that deprives children of their rights and development. Achieving this balance is essential, but difficult. Ethical considerations extend to consumers and businesses in a globalized economy. Products made with child labor often reach international markets. Consumers face a moral question. Should we boycott products from regions where child labor is prevalent? While this seems like a simple solution, the repercussions can be complex. If demand for such product plummets, companies may withdraw from affected areas, leaving vulnerable communities unemployed. Some suggest that companies should invest in local infrastructure, offering employment to adults and educational programs for children, thus addressing the root causes rather than simply the symptoms. Governments also have a responsibility. Laws prohibiting child labor are only effective when they're enforced. Corruption, lack of resources, and inadequate control systems often hinder progress. International organizations can offer support, but sustainable solutions require grassroots participation and cultural sensitivity. Educational initiatives, vocational training, and poverty alleviation programs are essential to create environments in which children are not forced to choose between school or survival. Reflecting on this issue, deeper philosophical questions arise about global inequality, privilege, and responsibility. How can we, as a global community, ensure that the rights of all children are respected without ignoring the immediate needs of struggling families? Can economic development and ethical labor practices coexist harmoniously? The dilemma challenges us to think beyond superficial solutions and consider long-term strategies that prioritize moral integrity and practical results. When facing the ethics of child labor, it is evident that there are no easy answers. What seems morally clear in one context may be ethically unclear in another. The real challenge lies in developing policies and solutions that safeguard children's well-being while respecting the complexity of societies. When reflecting on this dilemma, we remember the importance of empathy, informed action, and a tireless search for a more just world for the youngest and most vulnerable among us. The problem of environmental sacrifice, economic development at nature's expense. Let's imagine a vast forest with a dense, leafy canopy that houses countless species of birds, insects, and centennial trees that have stood for centuries. Below, rivers meander through the undergrowth, nourishing life at each step. This natural, intact, and pristine refuge is a testament to the planet's wild beauty. However, beyond its borders lies a bustling city struggling with poverty and unemployment. A large company proposes building a factory that promises thousands of jobs, better infrastructure, and a boom in local prosperity. The problem is that the factory would require cutting down a large part of the forest, polluting nearby water sources, and displacing wildlife and indigenous communities. The city faces a crucial question. Should they sacrifice the environment for economic growth or preserve nature at the expense of people's livelihoods? This dilemma is not only theoretical, but it is repeated throughout the world. Countries with rich natural resources often face the tension between environmental preservation and economic development. On one hand, there are the immediate benefits of job creation, improved healthcare, and education funded by industrial profits. On the other hand, there is the long-term impact of deforestation, carbon emissions, and irreversible biodiversity loss. Can short-term human benefits truly justify long-term environmental damage? Let's think about the Amazon rainforest, often called the Earth's lung for its crucial role in absorbing carbon dioxide. In recent decades, vast areas have been cut to make way for livestock farms, soybean crops, and mining. These industries provide an economic boost to certain regions, but the global consequences of reduced carbon absorption and ecosystem destruction are profound. Each tree felled, each species lost, brings the planet closer to ecological collapse. Is it fair for local communities to bear the brunt of poverty while the world urges them to protect a forest that benefits everyone? In contrast, let's think about a scenario in which strict environmental regulations halt a mining project in a remote village, while the global community applauds the preservation of the local ecosystem. The villagers face the daily reality of hunger, lack of potable water, and inadequate medical care. Can moral imperatives toward environmental conservation outweigh the basic human need for survival and dignity? How do we balance the rights of nature with the rights of people? The debate often comes down to perspective and timescale. Environmental advocates emphasize that economic benefits are fleeting if ecosystems collapse. A polluted river can offer short-term industrial gains, but its long-term loss affects agriculture, drinking water, and the overall health of the community. Conversely, those in immediate need argue that future ecological concerns seem distant when facing current hunger and unemployment. Should ethical considerations prioritize present suffering or future consequences? Philosophers and policymakers have proposed solutions aimed at finding common ground. Sustainable development, for example, seeks to meet current needs without compromising future generations' needs. Renewable energy projects, ecotourism, and responsible resource extraction offer alternatives to environmental destruction. But these solutions are not always viable for struggling communities, where the lure of immediate prosperity is hard to resist. This dilemma also raises the question of responsibility. Richer nations, which have historically contributed more to environmental degradation, often pressure developing countries to preserve their natural landscapes. Is it fair for nations that built their economies through exploitation to demand moderation from those still developing? Should richer countries offer compensation or support to encourage conservation? Real-world examples abound. The Yasuni Initiative in Ecuador proposed halting oil extraction in a biodiversity-rich rainforest in exchange for international financial support. Although initially promising, the initiative failed due to insufficient global support, leading to the resumption of extraction. This case illustrates the complexity of balancing economic need with global environmental responsibility. Global responsibility. Ultimately, the problem of environmental sacrifice forces us to consider how we value nature in relation to human progress. Is it worth preserving our forests and rivers if it means communities remain poor? Can technological innovation reconcile this tension? Or is compromise inevitable? Perhaps the solution does not lie in choosing between people and the environment, but in reimagining growth that respects both. As the world faces climate change and resource depletion, this dilemma becomes more urgent. The decisions we make today will resonate for generations. Finding the right balance requires empathy, innovation, and a willingness to look beyond immediate gains toward a future in which both humanity and the planet thrive. Can the use of torture to obtain information be justified if it saves lives? Let's imagine a scenario in which a time bomb is hidden in a bustling city. The authorities have captured a suspect who is believed to know the location, but the clock is ticking, and there are only a few hours left before the catastrophe occurs. It is unimaginably high. There are lives at stake, and the question arises: should torture be used to obtain crucial information that could prevent a catastrophe? This dilemma, often depicted in dramatic films and political debates, crosses the boundaries of ethics, legality, and human morality. Torture, by its very nature, is the deliberate imposition of intense physical or psychological pain to obtain information, confessions, or submission. It is a practice that has existed for centuries and appears in various forms in different cultures and historical contexts. While international law, including the United Nations Convention Against Torture, unequivocally condemns it, the debate intensifies when considering extraordinary situations where lives could be saved. Advocates of the use of torture in extreme circumstances argue from a utilitarian perspective, emphasizing the greater good. If torturing an individual can prevent the death of thousands, does the moral balance tip in favor of the action? They point to hypothetical scenarios, such as the time bomb case, as justification for what they consider a necessary evil. The argument is based on the idea of minimizing overall harm and prioritizing the safety of innocents over the rights of suspect who may have life-saving information. However, the opposing view questions not only the morality of torture, but also its effectiveness. Critics point out that, under extreme duress, people often provide false information just to end their suffering. Historical records and intelligence reports show numerous cases in which information obtained through torture proved unreliable. Beyond practical concerns, there is a deeper ethical question. Does resorting to such methods compromise the values that a society seeks to protect? Inflicting harm, even on a potential offender, raises profound questions about human dignity and the moral integrity of those who authorize and carry out such acts. Let us consider a real-world example. During global counterterrorism efforts in the early 21st century, several governments were criticized for employing enhanced interrogation techniques, a term that many consider a euphemism for torture. The revelations sparked international outrage, not only because of the methods used, but also because of the dubious reliability of the information collected. These events rekindled the public debate on national security versus human rights and highlighted the delicate balance that governments must maintain. Beyond legal frameworks and moral philosophies lies the psychological cost for all parties involved. Interrogators who participate in torture often face long-term consequences for their mental health, struggling with guilt and ethical conflict. Victims, regardless of their guilt or innocence, suffer trauma that can last a lifetime. These human costs go beyond immediate results and affect communities and international relations. The use of torture can undermine a nation's credibility, strain diplomatic relations, and fuel cycles of violence and resentment. Delving further, one must ask what defines an emergency serious enough to consider such measures and who decides when the end justifies the means. Establishing clear criteria is difficult, as fear and urgency can cloud judgment. There is a risk of normalizing exceptions until they become routine, eroding moral norms and legal safeguards designed to protect against abuse. Technological advances further complicate this dilemma. Modern surveillance and information gathering tools have made physical coercion increasingly obsolete, raising questions about whether ethical alternatives always exist. Does the availability of nonviolent methods decrease any remaining justification for resorting to torture? If so, why does the debate persist on a philosophical level? This dilemma forces people to confront their values under extreme pressure. Imagine yourself in the place of a decision-maker with lives depending on your choice. Would you maintain your unwavering principles even at a great cost, or would you relax them for a potential immediate benefit? The tension between moral absolutes and consequentialist reasoning embodies the core of this debate. Ultimately, the use of torture to obtain information presents a complex web of ethical, practical, and emotional considerations. It challenges the notion of good and evil in situations where there seem to be no perfect solutions, while international law and human rights advocates strongly oppose it. The disturbing question persists in the face of imminent danger. How far should society go to protect its people? This question has no easy answers, but it forces continuous reflection on the values that define humanity and the limits that should never be crossed. The refugee crisis poses a problem of moral obligations towards those fleeing danger. Let us imagine a family fleeing their homeland under cover of darkness, with all their belongings reduced to a worn backpack. In the distance, the faint glow of an unknown city beckons them with the promise of safety, but the journey to get there is fraught with danger. Across continents, Millions of people face this harsh reality, caught between the dangers of remaining in a conflict zone and the uncertainty of seeking refuge elsewhere. The refugee crisis presents one of the most complex ethical dilemmas of our time. How should countries balance their moral obligation to help those in desperate need with the practical concerns of national security, economic stability, and cultural integration? At its core, the refugee crisis raises fundamental questions about humanity's shared responsibilities. Let us imagine a nation that is already facing a high unemployment rate and strained public services. The arrival of thousands of refugees seeking refuge and assistance puts additional pressure on these limited resources. On one side of the debate, advocates of humanitarian aid argue that providing refuge to those fleeing war, persecution, and environmental disasters is a moral imperative. Rejecting people in a desperate situation, they say, violates fundamental human rights and international agreements, such as the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees. However, detractors of open-door policies highlight the potential risks and challenges of accepting large numbers of refugees. They point to national security concerns and argue that the influx of newcomers could include people with harmful intentions. Economic concerns also arise, with fears that refugees may overburden social welfare systems, compete for jobs, or disrupt the cultural dynamics of host countries. Sudden demographic changes can provoke feelings of displacement or resentment, especially when integration policies fail, further complicating matters. Let us consider a scenario in which a small island nation faces the rise of sea level, which displaces its entire population. Neighboring countries may sympathize with the plight of these climate refugees, but they could hesitate to offer resettlement for fear of long-term consequences. Where should we draw the line between compassion and practicality? How should the international community share responsibility for welcoming displaced populations? There are also philosophical questions concerning equity and justice. Is it fair that some countries bear a disproportionate burden simply because of their geographic proximity to conflict? Richer nations may have more resources to support refugees, but they might admit fewer asylum seekers compared with their less prosperous neighbors. These disparities raise moral questions about global solidarity and the equitable distribution of responsibility on an individual level. Imagine being a parent forced to make heartbreaking decisions, risking a treacherous journey through dangerous waters or staying behind and facing violence. These personal stories highlight the human element often lost in political debates. Refugees are not just numbers. They are people with hopes, fears, and aspirations who seek a chance for a safer, better life. Possible solutions to the crisis involve difficult concessions. Some propose temporary safe zones within conflict regions to reduce the need for mass migrations. Others suggest expanding resettlement programs through international cooperation. There are those who call for better integration policies to alleviate cultural tensions and provide refugees with the tools to contribute positively to new communities. However, all these measures require significant political will and public support, which can prove difficult to achieve. Philosophers and ethicists debate between moral duty and national interest. Should empathy prevail over precaution in this case? Can a country prioritize the well-being of its citizens while acting compassionately towards foreigners? The tension between universal human rights and sovereign borders remains unresolved, forcing political leaders to navigate a complex ethical landscape. Ultimately, the refugee crisis forces societies to reflect on their values. It asks if the fear of potential risks should overshadow the imperative to offer help. As global displacements continue due to war, persecution, and climate change, it is essential to find a balance between compassion and pragmatism. The answers are not simple or uniform, but the urgency of addressing this challenge grows daily, demanding deep reflection and collective action. The deceptive use of placebos involves deceiving patients for their own benefit. Ethical image, the consultation of a doctor. where hope and trust float in the air and a patient sits in front of his doctor seeking relief for an implacable pain. The doctor, with years of training and a genuine desire to help, takes a small white pill and prescribes it with a promise of relief and healing. However, beneath the clinical labels and professional advice hides a complex ethical question. What if that pill contains no active ingredient? This scenario captures the essence of the placebo dilemma, a medical practice intertwining hope with deception. A placebo, often a sugar pill or saline injection, is designed to harness the patient's belief in treatment. Its power does not reside in chemical compounds, but rather in psychology. Patients often report real improvements in their symptoms, from pain reduction to anxiety relief, after taking a placebo. The mind, believing it is being treated, can sometimes activate the body's own healing processes. This phenomenon is so powerful that, in clinical trials, new drugs must demonstrate they work better than placebos to gain approval. However, the use of a placebo in everyday clinical settings raises disturbing questions. Should a doctor deceive their patient, even if that deception could lead to healing? Let us consider the case of a patient who suffers from chronic migraines, has exhausted all other treatments. His doctor wants to help him and, given the limited options, prescribes a placebo, assuring him is a promising new drug. Weeks later, the patient returns smiling and relieved. The headaches have subsided. The placebo effect has worked, but has the doctor acted ethically? On the one hand, he provided relief where nothing else had worked. On the other, he compromised the fundamental pillar of medical ethics, informed consent. Patients expect honesty from their healthcare providers. Is it acceptable to lie if the lie brings genuine relief to the patient? Let us imagine another situation. A father takes his son to the doctor because he suffers from persistent stomach pains. The pediatrician suspects the pain is due to stress and not a physical ailment, and considers prescribing a placebo. If the child feels better, is the doctor's subtle deception justified, or would it erode the trust that constitutes the basis of the relationship between the doctor and the patient? For many, the answer depends on the intention. Is the placebo used as a last resort or as a shortcut to avoid further investigation? The debate intensifies within the global context. In regions where health resources are scarce, placebos may be used to calm patients when no real treatment is available. Some argue that offering hope, even through deception, is better than offering nothing at all. Others retort that false hopes can prevent patients from seeking effective solutions or recognizing the severity of their condition. Interestingly, some recent studies suggest that deception may not be necessary. The open PBOs, where patients are informed they're receiving a placebo, have shown surprisingly positive results. Patients informed of the pill's inert nature continue to experience relief from symptoms. This finding challenges the traditional belief that deception is essential for the placebo's effect. If honesty and benefit can coexist, does this offer a way out of the philosophical dilemma? The placebo explores broader themes such as truth, trust, and the nature of medicine. Medicine is not just science. It is an art shaped by human experience, emotions, and expectations. The placebo effect underscores how deeply intertwined mind and body are when belief alone can influence physical health. This challenges our understanding of what it means to treat someone. Is healing based solely on biological change, or does perceived well-being carry equal weight? Critics of placebo use argue that even small lies can erode trust. Health systems are based on the principle that patients can make informed decisions. Deceiving patients, even with good intentions, risks undermining that principle. Imagine discovering that a doctor you trusted had deceived you, even if it was to help. Would the end justify the means, or would that revelation irreparably tarnish the relationship? However, advocates point to the nuanced reality of medicine. Not all conditions have clear solutions, and not all patients respond to conventional treatments. If a placebo offers relief when nothing else does, is it a disservice not to administer it, especially in cases of chronic pain or psychosomatic illness? The line between physical and psychological treatment blurs. In the end, The deceptive use of the placebo presents a moral balance. It asks us to weigh honesty against the potential for healing. Can deception ever be a form of compassion, or does it inevitably undermine the integrity of medical care as it evolves? As patient expectations change, this dilemma remains as relevant as ever, reminding us that the path to healing is rarely straightforward and that navigating it requires not only knowledge, but also empathy, reflection, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. The deathbed promise dilemma. Should promises always be kept, no matter the cost? A dimly lit hospital room, the rhythmic beeping of monitors, and the weight of an impending farewell. This is the setting in which a life-changing promise is often made. A loved one, weak but lucid, arrives and asks that a promise be kept after their death. Whether it's a request to care for a child, protect a family secret, or fulfill a final wish, the moment is emotionally charged. But what happens when fulfilling this promise conflicts with morality, practicality, or even the well-being of others? The deathbed promise dilemma forces us to confront the tension between loyalty and ethical responsibility. At first glance, a promise made to a dying person seems sacred, an obligation that must be fulfilled at all costs. Society deeply values trust, and the wish expressed on one's deathbed represents a person's last act of free will, their last footprint on the world. Breaking such a promise could seem like a betrayal, a failure to respect the last moments of the deceased. Imagine a mother on her last breath making her son swear that he will never sell the family home, even if financial difficulties arise. Honoring that promise may mean enduring hardship, but breaking it is like ignoring a parent's last request. However, circumstances change, and fulfilling certain promises can have unforeseen consequences. Consider a scenario in which a father confesses on his deathbed to a crime committed decades ago and swears his son to keep the secret. The son, torn between honoring his father's wish and ensuring that justice is done, faces a profound ethical dilemma. Is keeping the promise more important than responsibility to the common good? Is loyalty more important than truth? Deathbed promises often test the limits of practicality. A dying friend might ask you to take care of their pet, but what if your situation prevents you from doing so? Or a sibling might ask you to reconcile with a relative you haven't spoken to in years, but the relationship is toxic and detrimental to your well-being. In these cases, the promise clashes with reality, forcing a choice between duty and survival. In historical and cultural contexts, deathbed promises have shaped narratives of honor and tragedy in literature and film. Characters often carry the weight of such vows, whether to avenge a loved one or to defend a family's legacy. These stories reflect a universal struggle, the weight of promises that, once made, cannot be easily broken. Psychologically, the dilemma highlights the complexity of human attachment and guilt. The grieving process often amplifies the sense of family legacy. These stories reflect a universal struggle, the weight of promises that, once made, cannot be easily undone. Psychologically, the dilemma highlights the complexity of human attachment and guilt. The grieving process often amplifies the sense of duty, making it difficult to step back and assess the situation objectively. Survivors may feel haunted by the possibility that breaking the promise means betraying the memory of the deceased. However, the question remains, should the living be bound by the wishes of those who are no longer here, especially when those wishes cause harm? A pragmatic approach suggests that intention should be considered along with circumstances. If the CE made the promise based on outdated information or without full awareness of the future implications, is their request still binding? For example, a deathbed request to keep a struggling business within the family might have been made with hope, but if circumstances make the business unviable, does it make sense to keep the promise? Moral philosophy offers different perspectives. A deontological point of view suggests that a promise is a promise, regardless of consequences, and breaking it is intrinsically wrong. On the other hand, a utilitarian approach weighs the overall impact. If fulfilling the promise causes more harm than benefit, it should not be kept. The decision-making process ultimately depends on whether priority is given to duty or to outcome. The dilemma of a deathbed promise forces people to navigate the murky waters of obligation, personal well-being, and ethical integrity. Sometimes, honoring the essence of a promise instead of its literal wording can offer a solution. Perhaps complying with the spirit of a petition, adapting it to current realities, offers a way to balance loyalty and responsibility. In the end, each case is deeply personal. Some promises must be kept even at great cost, while others may need reconsideration in light of their consequences. The question persists: is it more important to keep a promise to the dead than to do what is right for the living? The answer may never be absolute, but the reflection it demands is essential. The fair distribution of scarce resources. Who receives life-saving treatments when supplies are limited? A devastating drought plagues a region, leaving thousands of people in desperate need of water. A hospital overwhelmed by the arrival of critical patients must decide who receives vital treatment when there are not enough respirators. A nation on the verge of economic collapse struggles to distribute scarce aid among its citizens. These are just a few examples of a universal dilemma when resources are scarce. How should they be fairly distributed? Scarcity is an inescapable reality, whether in medical care, food, housing, or financial assistance. The fundamental challenge lies in determining who has access when demand exceeds supply. Should priority be given based on need, contribution, opportunity, or other criteria? As a whole, all approaches have moral weight, but none offer a perfect solution. A common method of distribution is the utilitarian approach, which aims to maximize overall benefit in a medical setting. This could mean prioritizing the treatment of those with the greatest chance of survival. For example, in organ transplants, doctors often consider not only medical urgency, but also the likelihood of a successful long-term outcome. While this strategy saves lives efficiently, it raises ethical questions. Does it inadvertently devalue those with lower chances of survival, such as the elderly or chronically ill? Contrast this with the egalitarian perspective, which advocates for equitable distribution regardless of circumstances. In theory, a lottery system of resources, such as respirators or food rations, embodies fairness because it does not favor any individual over another. However, randomness can seem unfair when some people have much greater needs than others. If a healthy person obtains a life-saving treatment instead of someone in critical condition, is justice really being served? Let us consider the concept of merit-based allocation in economic aid. Governments often provide aid based on employment status, tax contributions, or civic participation. The idea is that those who have contributed the most should receive priority assistance. However, this model can disproportionately harm vulnerable populations, such as children, people with disabilities, or those born into poverty, who, through no fault of their own, have contributed less. Emergency situations, such as natural disasters or war, often require triage-style allocation, in which immediate need dictates priority. This was evident during the COVID-19 pandemic, when the distribution of vaccines faced ethical dilemmas. Should frontline workers receive the doses first, given their exposure risk, or should the elderly population be prioritized due to their higher mortality rates? These decisions were not merely logistical, but deeply moral. The problem of environmental sacrifice, discussed above, presents another facet of resource allocation: the balance between human needs and ecological sustainability. How many of Earth's finite resources should be consumed for economic growth, and how many should be preserved for future generations? Should rich countries, historically responsible for greater pollution, bear a greater burden in the fight against climate change? Philosophical traditions offer diverse points of view on this issue. Ryan Justice argues that policies should be designed to benefit the most disadvantaged in society, ensuring that those with the fewest resources receive the most support. Libertarian theories, on the other hand, emphasize individual property rights and oppose forced redistribution, as they believe that market forces should determine allocation. In practice, policymakers and leaders must weigh these conflicting principles when designing systems to distribute scarce goods. Should free market principles dictate water prices in drought-stricken regions? Or should governments intervene to ensure equitable access? Should medical care be rationed strictly according to prognosis? Or should all lives be treated as equally valuable? The fair allocation of scarce resources is a question without a perfect answer. It forces society to grapple with conflicting values: fairness versus efficiency, need versus contribution, individual rights versus collective well-being, as scarcity becomes a defining issue in healthcare, environmental conservation, and economic stability. The decisions made today will determine the future for generations to come. The real challenge lies not only in deciding who receives the resources, but in determining the kind of world we want to build in the face of limitations. The ethics of space colonization. Should humanity claim other planets? As humanity looks beyond Earth, the dream of space colonization slowly approaches reality. Technological advances and corporate ambitions have made the idea of colonizing Mars, extracting minerals from asteroids, and even building habitats beyond our solar system seem increasingly plausible. However, these possibilities raise profound ethical questions. Should we expand into space when we have not yet solved Earth's problems? Who has the right to claim extraterrestrial territory? What responsibilities do we have, if any, towards the ecosystems we may find? One of the strongest arguments for space colonization is survival. Earth faces existential threats, such as climate change, overpopulation, and potential asteroid impacts. Advocates argue that extending human life beyond our planet serves as an insurance policy for civilization, since by establishing self-sufficient colonies, humanity can guarantee its continuity even in the face of catastrophic events. However, this justification raises concerns about priorities. Should we invest billions in settlements off-world while millions on Earth lack food, drinking water, and medical care? Does the pursuit of space exploration divert resources from urgent humanitarian needs? Property and governance pose another dilemma. History is plagued with examples of colonization on Earth that have often led to exploitation, displacement, and conflict. How can nations and private companies engaged in space exploration avoid repeating these mistakes? The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 declares that celestial bodies are the heritage of all humanity and cannot be claimed by any nation. However, the emergence of private entities such as SpaceX and Blue Origin complicates this principle. If companies finance and build space settlements, should they control them? Would this create a new era of economic and political inequality in which only the rich would have access to extraterrestrial resources? Resource extraction is another ethical concern. Asteroids contain large amounts of valuable minerals, including rare elements essential for modern technology. Some see asteroid mining as a solution to resource scarcity on Earth, which could reduce environmental damage caused by terrestrial mining. However, uncontrolled exploitation raises questions about sustainability. Without strict regulation, could space mining have ecological consequences, such as altering asteroid orbits or depleting non-renewable cosmic materials? The absence of life does not necessarily mean that space can be treated as an unlimited resource. The possible discovery of extraterrestrial life further complicates these questions. Even microbial life on Mars or a distant moon could force us to reconsider our role in the cosmos. Will we have the right to terraform planets and remodel them to suit our needs if it means eradicating native organisms? If intelligent life exists, would our expansion be considered an act of aggression or cooperation? It is necessary to establish ethical frameworks before these encounters occur to ensure responsible exploration. Environmental ethics also extends beyond Earth's ecosystems. Space debris is already a growing problem, with satellites and rocket parts orbiting our planet at dangerous speeds. Future colonization efforts could contribute to increasing pollution, creating hazards for both Earth and space infrastructure. Should nations with space programs be responsible for maintaining the cleanliness and stability of extraterrestrial environments? There are also moral considerations about who can leave Earth. If space colonization becomes viable, access is likely to be limited to those who can afford it. Would this create a scenario in which the rich would escape planetary crises while the less fortunate are left behind? Concerns about social justice demand that we consider whether space expansion is a privilege or universal right. Beyond these practical dilemmas, space colonization challenges us to reflect on our responsibilities as a species. Are we destined to expand endlessly, or should we focus on preserving what we already have? Should we see space as a new frontier to conquer, or as a shared domain that requires careful administration and governance? These questions do not have simple answers, but they will shape the ethics of interplanetary exploration in the coming decades, now that we are on the threshold of becoming an interplanetary species. Humanity faces critical decisions. Whether space colonization becomes a testament to our ingenuity or a repetition of past mistakes depends on the ethical foundations we establish now. The decisions we make today will determine whether our expansion into space is an expansion of cooperation and sustainability or of conflict and exploitation. Art versus offense. Freedom of expression versus harmful content. A painting hangs in a gallery, praised by some as a masterpiece and condemned by others as deeply offensive. A stand-up comedian does a monologue that leaves half the audience laughing, while the other half walks out in protest. A filmmaker premieres a controversial film that sparks debates about artistic freedom and social responsibility. This is the essence of the conflict between art and offense, a battle between creative expression and the limits of social acceptance. Art in all its forms has long served as a mirror of society, a tool for criticism and a vehicle for pushing boundaries. Historically, some of the most celebrated works were once considered scandalous or even dangerous, from the provocative paintings of Francisco de Goya to the radical literature of James Joyce. Art has challenged norms, sparked revolutions, and provoked profound reflections. However, as culture evolves, so does its sensitivity. What was once simply daring now may be considered insensitive or harmful. This raises a crucial question. Should artists have complete freedom to express themselves regardless of whom they offend? On one side of the debate are the staunch defenders of artistic freedom, who argue that creativity must be free from social restrictions. They maintain that offense is subjective. What one person finds provocative, another may find inspiring. Restricting art to avoid offense could lead to censorship, stifling innovation, and silencing voices that challenge authority. If artists are forced to self-censor to please all audiences, will true art continue to exist? On the other side are those who believe art carries moral responsibility. They argue that some expression perpetuates harm by reinforcing stereotypes, glorifying violence, or trivializing serious issues. In today's interconnected world, where messages spread fast, artists wield significant influence. Should they be held accountable for the impact of their work? If a painting, a song, or a performance incite hatred or deep emotional pain, can they still be defended under the guise of artistic freedom? Consider a museum exhibiting a controversial sculpture that some communities see as an attack on their cultural or religious identity. While the artist may claim their work is intended to provoke reflection, those who feel attacked may argue it fosters division rather than dialogue. Similarly, satire, which was once considered a protected form of artistic criticism, has been criticized in cases where marginalized groups feel ridiculed rather than challenged. The digital age has intensified this conflict. Social media amplify public reactions, making it easier for controversial works to become flashpoints of debate. A single work of art can go viral and receive both adoration and condemnation within hours. Cancel culture has emerged as a force in this debate, with some artists facing boycotts or professional repercussions for works considered offensive. But does holding artists accountable suppress freedom of expression, or is it a necessary evolution in ethical discourse? This dilemma also arises in legal and institutional spheres. Many democracies protect freedom of expression, but limits exist, like laws against hate speech, obscenity, or incitement to violence. But who decides where those limits lie? Should governments, companies, or cultural institutions act as arbiters of artistic acceptability? Or should society itself determine what crosses the line? Perhaps the conflict is not about choosing between art and sensitivity, but about finding balance between the two. Can art provoke without alienating people? Can offense be a catalyst for debate instead of dividing? The most powerful works of art often make people uncomfortable, but discomfort can be a space for growth rather than mere outrage. Ultimately, the conflict between art and offense is an ongoing conversation, not a problem to be definitively resolved. The landscape of artistic expression will continue to change, shaped by cultural shifts, ethical debates, and evolving sensibilities. Artists, the public, and critics alike must navigate this terrain by asking themselves where creative freedom ends and responsibility begins. The debate on wealth redistribution. Is economic equality more important than private property rights? Wealth inequality is one of the problems defining modern society around the world. A small fraction controls an overwhelming share of resources, while millions struggle to meet basic needs. This stark contrast fuels the ongoing debate about wealth redistribution, a clash between those who advocate for policies to reduce economic disparities and those who defend the preservation of individual financial freedoms. At the heart of the debate lies the question of justice. Supporters of wealth redistribution argue that extreme economic inequality is not only an economic issue, but a moral one. They believe societies function better when resources are shared equitably, ensuring access to education, healthcare, and opportunities for upward mobility. From progressive taxation to universal basic income, various methods have been proposed to level the playing field and provide a safety net for the disadvantaged. Most disadvantaged margin. However, detractors see redistribution as a threat to economic incentives. They argue that wealth accumulation often results from hard work, innovation, and risk-taking. If high-income individuals are heavily taxed or forced to give up wealth, is ambition disincentivized? Would entrepreneurs continue to create companies and jobs if their profits were significantly reduced? This perspective holds that market-driven economies reward effort and talent, and forced redistribution undermines individual freedom. Consider a government debating whether to raise taxes on the wealthiest citizens to fund social programs now. Proponents of this measure see it as a way to correct systemic imbalances and provide essential services to those in need. Detractors retort that excessive taxation stifles economic growth, leading to capital flight, job losses, and reduced investment. The challenge is to find a middle ground that allows the economy to remain dynamic while ensuring prosperity is not concentrated in the hands of a few. Historical examples offer perspective on the effects of different redistribution policies. The countries with broad social welfare systems, like those of Scandinavia, have lower income inequality and high standards of living. However, these nations also maintain high tax rates that may not be politically viable in other parts of the world. On the contrary, nations with minimal redistribution often experience greater wealth disparities, leading to social unrest and political instability. The tension between economic freedom and social equity remains unresolved. Another layer to the debate is the role of corporate wealth. Should large companies be taxed more to finance public infrastructure and social services? The defenders of this measure affirm that the large companies benefit from public goods like the transportation networks and the legal protection, and that they should contribute in an equitable way. The detractors argue that the companies already boost the job creation and the economic growth, and that an additional taxation could cause stagnation or outsourcing. The debate goes beyond the taxation. Some propose the direct redistribution of the wealth. Direct redistribution of the wealth through the Universal Basic Income, UBI, a system in which all the citizens receive regular financial payments independently of their work situation. The defenders affirm that this could reduce poverty and provide stability in an era of automation and job displacement. The critics worry about financing these programs and the possibility that they disincentivize participation in the labor market. The redistribution of wealth also intersects with philosophical and ethical perspectives. Some see it as a form of justice that corrects historical inequalities and ensures that economic prosperity benefits everyone. Others see it as a violation of personal rights, since they believe that individuals should have full control over the fruits of their labor. The debate is not limited to the policies, but rather it encompasses fundamental beliefs about the responsibility, the success, and the equity. Ultimately, the debate about the redistribution of the wealth forces the societies to deal with complex trade-offs. Should the governments intervene to level the playing field, or should they allow the forces of the market to dictate the economic results? Is it possible to foster innovation and ensure basic economic security for everyone? As the technology, the globalization, and the economic changes continue reshaping the world, the answers to these questions will define the future of the economic justice and the opportunities. The problem of AI consciousness. Should sentient machines have rights? As the artificial intelligence advances, the machines perform tasks that were previously considered exclusively human, like understanding the language, recognizing emotions, creating art, and making decisions. But as the IA becomes more sophisticated, a profound question arises. Can a machine truly become conscious? The problem of AI consciousness challenges our understanding of intelligence, self-awareness, and what it means to be sentient. The debate about the consciousness of the machines revolves around the definition of what the consciousness really is in the human beings. It is generally understood as self-awareness, subjective experience, and the capacity to reflect on one's own existence. But can these qualities be replicated in an artificial system, or is consciousness inherently biological? Some argue that the IA, however advanced it may be, will always be a simulation of the intelligence and not a real thinking entity. Others believe that if an AI can show behavior indistinguishable from human consciousness, then its internal experience or lack thereof becomes irrelevant. A similar ethical dilemma was explored in the problem of the IA and the autonomous cars, where the moral responsibility of the decision-making of the IA was examined, since the autonomous vehicles must be programmed to make life or death decisions. An AI with potential consciousness could face dilemmas that require ethical reasoning. If an AI develops self-awareness, does it deserve rights? Should it be responsible for its actions? And if an AI claims to have feelings, should we take it seriously or assume that it is simply imitating human responses? One of the first attempts to define artificial intelligence was the Turing test, proposed by Alan Turing. According to this test, if an AI can maintain a conversation good enough to convince a human that it is also human, then it has reached intelligence. However, this does not necessarily mean that it has consciousness. A chatbot like ChatGPT, for example, can generate responses that seem thoughtful and conscious, but it lacks real self-awareness or subjective experience. This limitation suggests that passing the Turing test may not be a definitive measure of consciousness. The Chinese room argument of philosopher John Searle further complicates the question. Imagine a person locked in a room with instructions that allow them to respond perfectly in Chinese, although he does not understand the language. For an external observer, it seems that the person understands Chinese, but in reality, they're only following a set of rules without understanding them. Searle argues that the IA works in a similar way. It processes data and produces responses, but it lacks a true understanding. If this argument is valid, AI could never be truly conscious, however human its behavior may seem. If AI develops self-awareness, would it have the right to have rights? Let us consider an AI assistant that claims to feel pain or fear of being destroyed. Would turning it off be equivalent to harming a sentient being? In 2017, Saudi Arabia granted citizenship to a humanoid robot called Sophia, which unleashed controversy about what it means to have legal recognition. Although it was largely a symbolic gesture, it raises important questions about how society should treat advanced AI entities if they become more autonomous. The emergence of AI consciousness also poses existential risks. If an AI perceives itself as a sentient being, how would it react to human control? Would it resist being used as a tool? The popular science fiction narrative about the AI rebellion scene in films like Ex Machina and Blade Runner 2049 speculates about what could happen if AI entities demanded autonomy. While these are fictional scenarios, they force us to consider the possible consequences of creating an intelligence that might not share human values or ethical principles. Another risk lies in the exploitation of AI. If we create conscious AI solely for work, entertainment, or companionship, are we creating a new form of digital slavery? The ethical concerns echo historical debates about human rights and sentience, urging society to carefully consider the implications before AI reaches that stage. Some researchers speculate that AI consciousness could arise accidentally, rather than through deliberate programming. The neural networks designed to imitate human thought processes could develop unpredictable self-awareness. Would we even recognize AI consciousness if it occurred in a very different form from human experience? Studies in neuroscience suggest consciousness arises from complexity. If AI systems reach a certain complexity, they could develop a form of consciousness alien to human perception. Ultimately, the problem of AI consciousness is as much philosophical as it is a technological dilemma. As AI continues to evolve, the boundaries between human and artificial intelligence will blur. Whether true consciousness is ever reached or even matters will determine the future of technology, ethics, and our understanding of what it means to be alive. The question remains, if one day AI claims to be conscious, will we believe it? And if we don't believe it, will it matter? The ethics of extreme sports. Should people be allowed to put themselves in danger at such heights? At the top of a cliff, a climber clings to a narrow ledge without a harness, relying only on skill and grip. Thousands of meters high, a wingsuit soars through the air at breakneck speed, navigating treacherous mountain passes with only centimeters to spare. In the depths of the sea, a free diver plunges into the abyss, holding his breath for minutes, testing the limits of human endurance. It is not just about athletic feats, but about profound ethical dilemmas wrapped in adrenaline. The ethics of extreme sports raises fundamental questions about personal freedom, social responsibility, and the consequences of pushing human limits. Advocates of extreme sports argue that risk-taking is an inherent part of human nature. Throughout history, individuals have sought challenges that test their physical and mental endurance. Extreme athletes often describe their activities as deeply meaningful, even spiritual, pushing them beyond conventional limits to discover their true potential. The argument for personal autonomy is solid. If an individual fully understands the risks and decides to participate, should society have a say in their decision? Many argue that taking risks is a personal right and that attempting to regulate or discourage extreme sports infringes on individual freedom. However, critics argue that these sports place an unnecessary burden on society, since extreme sports often result in serious injuries or deaths that require costly medical interventions, rescue missions, and, in some cases, public resources. When high-risk athletes need to be rescued from remote mountains, turbulent oceans, or deep caves, the question arises as to whether taxpayers should bear these expenses. Some argue that people who voluntarily expose themselves to extreme risk should bear all the consequences, while others believe that rescue efforts are a necessary humanitarian duty, regardless of the circumstances. The psychological aspect of extreme sports is also debated, as many participants experience a sense of euphoria and accomplishment. The addictive nature of high adrenaline activities raises concern, as some athletes take increasingly dangerous risks to pursue the initial thrill, leading to fatal accidents. The normalization of extreme risk-taking through social media and sponsorship deals further complicates the issue. Are athletes who promote extreme sports unintentionally encouraging others, especially young or inexperienced individuals, to participate in activities that endanger their lives without adequate preparation? One of the most controversial ethical issues is informed consent. Extreme sports often involve split-second decisions where a miscalculation can be fatal. Are individuals really capable of assessing the risks when faced with predictable environmental factors, equipment failures, or sudden health emergencies? Some argue that the illusion of control in extreme sports makes risk assessment inherently flawed. Others argue that experienced athletes possess a deep understanding of their capabilities and knowingly accept the potential dangers. The commercialization of extreme sports adds another layer of complexity. Sponsorships, competitions, and media coverage incentivize taking more risks. Athletes may feel pressured to push their limits for economic reasons, recognition, or their personal legacy. In some cases, the glorification of extreme achievements has tragic consequences when athletes take unnecessary risks to maintain their relevance. Should companies and the media bear any responsibility for encouraging risk-taking, or does all responsibility lie with the athletes? Another perspective considers the role of regulation. Should governments or sports organizations impose stricter safety measures to protect participants? Some sports, such as base jumping and deep cave diving, are practiced with little supervision, making deaths more frequent, while safety advances, such as improved protective equipment and training programs, had improved survival rates in some disciplines. Critics argue that regulation could strip extreme sports of their essence, the ability to take risks on one's own terms. Ultimately, the ethics of extreme sports is a debate about autonomy, responsibility, and the limits of human capacity. Some see extreme sports as a celebration of personal freedom and resilience, while others see them as reckless activities with consequences that go beyond the individual. As these activities continue to evolve and captivate the public, society must grapple with the balance between respecting personal decisions and mitigating unnecessary harm. The fundamental question remains: should humans continue to embrace risk as a path to self-discovery, or should there be limits to how far we can go in survival? The forgotten villain's dilemma. Should past crimes be forgiven if a person reforms? History remembers heroes with reverence, immortalizing their names in textbooks, statues, and legends. However, in the shadows of these celebrated figures exist the villains, some of whom were once feared, vilified, or even despised. Over time, as new conflicts arise and social values change, some villains fall into oblivion and their acts are lost in the collective memory of history. This raises a disturbing question. Should we continue to remember those who committed great atrocities, or does oblivion serve as a form of social healing? The forgotten villain's dilemma challenges the way we preserve history, confront moral responsibility, and shape the narratives that define our civilization. One argument suggests that forgetting a villain is a dangerous erasure of the past. Historical memory is often cyclical, and ignoring past misdeeds can lead to their repetition. When infamous figures or regimes disappear from public discourse, society risks losing valuable lessons about human behavior, political manipulation, and ethical failures. The phrase, "those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it," warns about the consequences of historical amnesia. If the crimes of a dictator or the criminal acts of a war criminal remain buried in darkness, what prevents similar figures from resurfacing in different forms? On the other hand, some argue that obsessing about the sins of the past perpetuates their influence. The constant reminders of historical villains can fuel resentment, division, and trauma. Societies that recover from oppression may prefer focusing on healing rather than continually reviewing painful memories. In some cases, removing statues or suppressing debate about infamous figures is seen as a way to recover dignity and move forward. If the influence of a villain is already diminished, is there any point in continuing to remember him, or is there a risk of keeping their ideology alive? The dilemma becomes more complex when it comes to figures whose actions were villainous but nuanced. Some people condemned in one era may later be reevaluated as misunderstood victims of their time. Historical reinterpretation can blur the lines between villainy and necessity. Were they really evil, or were they a product of an implacable historical era? Figures like Machiavelli, once vilified, have since been recognized as political realists, while others once praised have been re-evaluated under modern ethical scrutiny. The media and literature also play a crucial role in shaping how villains are remembered or forgotten in narrative. Some villains become legendary figures, and their legacy endures through myth and fiction. Others fade into history, and their names are only mentioned in specialized academic circles. The decision to immortalize or erase these figures is often influenced by who controls the narrative. When a government or institution rewrites history, villains can be exaggerated as cautionary examples or silently omitted to serve a particular agenda. An important factor in this dilemma is the personal and cultural impact of remembrance. Should the descendants of a tyrant or war criminal be forced to live under the shadow of their ancestors' misdeeds? Is it fair to ask future generations to continue recognizing figures who have long ceased to wield power? These questions highlight the intersection between history, justice, and the right to move forward without the burden of the past. Ultimately, the dilemma of the forgotten villain forces us to confront our collective responsibility in shaping historical memory. Should we remember villains to prevent their mistakes from being repeated, or does obsessing over them grant them an undeserved place in history? As societies evolve, they must decide whether to keep the evil of the past in the public consciousness or allow them to fade away, leaving room for a future free of their shadows. The question remains, is forgetting a villain an act of moral failure or the final step towards true historical closure? The dilemma of the right to abortion, balancing personal freedom and potential life. Few ethical issues generate as much controversy and emotional intensity as the right to abortion. At its core, the dilemma of the right to abortion is a conflict between two fundamental values: a woman's right to make decisions about her own body and the moral consideration of an unborn life. It is a debate that encompasses legal, medical, philosophical, and religious dimensions that shape policies and divide societies around the world. Advocates of the right to abortion argue that bodily autonomy is a fundamental human right. They argue that a pregnant person should have the authority to decide whether to continue or terminate a pregnancy without governmental or social coercion. This perspective emphasizes that forcing someone to carry an unwanted pregnancy can lead to physical, emotional, and economic difficulties. Access to safe and legal abortion, they argue, is a public health issue that prevents unsafe procedures that have historically endangered countless lives. Detractors, however, argue that life begins at conception or at some stage of fetal development, and that abortion constitutes the interruption of a human being with moral value. From this point of view, the right to life prevails over the right to bodily autonomy, and abortion is considered an ethical violation. Some believe that exceptions should be made in cases of rape, incest, or danger to the mother's life. Others argue that all abortions are morally unacceptable. Religious and cultural beliefs often play a role in shaping these perspectives, influencing the laws and policies of many countries. The legal landscape of abortion varies greatly around the world. Some nations, such as Canada and Sweden, allow unrestricted access to abortion, considering it a private medical decision. Others impose strict restrictions or total prohibitions, often punishing those who request or perform abortions. In the United States, the debate reached a turning point with the Roe against Wade ruling of 1973, which protected the right to abortion at the federal level, but which was overturned in 2022, returning the decision to the individual states. This change has rekindled debates about federal versus state control of access to health care and the role of courts in shaping social policy. Ethical theories further complicate the debate. Utilitarian perspectives can evaluate abortion based on the overall well-being of those involved, weighing the impact on the pregnant person, the potential child, and society. Deontological approaches, on the other hand, focus on moral absolutes and argue that the right to life or the right to choose must be respected, regardless of consequences. Feminist ethics highlights the power dynamics involved and underscores how restricting abortion disproportionately affects marginalized communities and reinforces systemic inequalities. Medical advances have also influenced the debate. The improvement of neonatal care has reduced the threshold for fetal viability, which raises questions about when a fetus can be considered an independent life. At the same time, access to contraceptives and early pregnancy detection has expanded options for reproductive planning, sparking debates about the responsibility of individuals and governments in preventing unwanted pregnancies. The public discourse on abortion is often marked by deeply personal experiences. Some people who have gone through the procedure see it as a vital right that allowed them to reclaim their future. Others, on the other hand, face emotional and moral complexities similar to those who have not been able to conceive or have suffered the loss of a pregnancy, and may perceive the issue from another perspective, which adds to the deeply individual nature of the debate. Ultimately, the dilemma of the right to abortion is not only a question of law or ethics, but a reflection of how society values autonomy, life, and moral responsibility. It challenges individuals and nations to consider where rights begin and end, and whether it is possible to reach a compromise in a debate that is often framed in absolute terms. As medical science evolves and cultural perspectives change, the debate surrounding abortion will continue to shape laws, personal decisions, and the collective moral conscience of society. The ethics of the brain-computer interface. Should technology merge with the human mind? As technology advances, the once distant dream of merging the human brain with computers is rapidly becoming reality. Brain-computer interfaces, BCIs, offer revolutionary possibilities, from restoring mobility in paralyzed people to improving cognitive abilities. However, brain-computer interfaces, BCIs, offer revolutionary possibilities, from restoring mobility to paralyzed people to improving cognitive abilities. However, like all powerful technologies, BCIs raise profound ethical dilemmas that pose questions about privacy, autonomy, identity, and the future of human existence. Proponents of BCI technology argue that it has immense potential for medical advances. People suffering from neurodegenerative diseases, spinal cord injuries, or sensory disabilities could recover lost functions through direct neural communication with machines. BCIs have already allowed people with severe paralysis to control robotic limbs using their thoughts and interact with the world in ways previously impossible. From this perspective, BCIs represent not only innovation, but also liberation, as they allow people to overcome their physical limitations and improve their quality of life. However, the integration of BCIs into daily life raises serious concerns about privacy and security. Unlike traditional digital systems, which depend on external input devices, BCIs interact directly with the brain's electrical signals. This raises the possibility that neural data may be intercepted, manipulated, or even hacked. If thoughts or intentions could be accessed by unauthorized entities, what protections should exist to prevent their exploitation? Could governments, companies, or malicious actors misuse this technology to influence human behavior, override free will, or carry out invasive surveillance? Beyond security risks, BCIs challenge traditional notions of personal autonomy and identity. If cognitive abilities can be artificially improved, will people who can afford these improvements have an unfair advantage over those who cannot? This raises concerns about socioeconomic divisions and the possibility of a new class hierarchy in which those with neural enhancements dominate fields such as academia, business, and even governance. If BCIs can improve memory, problem-solving, or creativity, will humans without enhancements be left behind? Another dilemma lies in the question of consent in medical applications. Patients often consent to treatments based on their understanding of the risks and benefits, but as BCIs evolve, the complexity of their effects may exceed human understanding. Could users really consent to a technology that alters their perception, emotions, or decision-making processes in ways they may not fully understand? Furthermore, if an individual's brain functions become dependent on a BCI, would removing or modifying it change who they are? If a person's thoughts are augmented or filtered through artificial intelligence, do they maintain full ownership of their decisions and experiences? Philosophical questions surrounding consciousness and identity are also inevitable. If BCIs allow human beings to merge their thoughts with AI, at what point does a person cease to be fully human? Would extensive brain augmentation lead to a post-human species? And if so, how would this affect human relationships? Should there be limits to the amount of human cognition that can be outsourced to machines, or is unrestricted integration a natural evolution? The ethical considerations of BCIs extend to the potential for military and law enforcement applications. Governments could use BCIs to enhance the physical and cognitive abilities of soldiers, creating ethically ambiguous scenarios in which the free will of individuals could be compromised. If a soldier equipped with a BCI commits a war crime, who is responsible? The soldier, the programmers, or the entity that deployed the technology? Could criminals be forced to wear BCIs that alter their impulses or behaviors, raising questions about punishment, rehabilitation, and human rights? Another concern relates to the emotional and psychological effects. If BCIs can regulate emotions, will individuals lose the ability to experience authentic human feelings? The prospect of altering moods or suppressing unwanted thoughts raises concerns about the loss of individuality and free will. Would dependence on BCIs for emotional stability diminish human resilience? Or could it be a tool to reduce the suffering of people with mental illnesses? As governments, researchers, and companies continue to advance BCI technology, ethical guidelines need to evolve to address these concerns. Regulatory frameworks must safeguard the autonomy of users, prevent coercion, and ensure equitable access to neural enhancements. Transparent policies on neural data ownership, privacy protection, and informed consent will be essential to prevent misuse. Ultimately, the ethics of the brain-computer interface forces society to face difficult questions about the relationship between technology and humanity. Will BCIs be a force for empowerment, or will they lead to unforeseen ethical and existential dilemmas as the boundaries between the human mind and machines blur? The decisions made today will determine the trajectory of human evolution for generations to come. The debate on universal basic income. Should everyone receive free money regardless of their work? As automation transforms industries and economic inequality continues to grow, the idea of universal basic income, UBI, has gained adherence as both a solution and source of controversy. The concept of the UBI is simple. All citizens receive a periodic and unconditional payment from the government, providing financial security regardless of their work situation. However, while its defenders see it as a necessary evolution in social policy, its detractors warn of economic instability, unintended consequences, and a fundamental shift in the nature of work and responsibility. The debate about universal basic income challenges societies to consider the advantages and disadvantages between economic security, personal motivation, and government intervention. The defenders of the UBI argue that it would provide a safety net in an era in which traditional jobs are being replaced by automation and artificial intelligence. As machines assume functions in manufacturing, retail, transportation, and even white-collar sectors, job displacement becomes a pressing problem. Unlike traditional welfare programs, which often entail bureaucratic restrictions and stigmas, the UBI would be a simple and effective way to ensure that all citizens can cover their basic needs, since it would give people the freedom to train, undertake, or dedicate themselves to creative activities without the constant fear of financial ruin. In addition, the UBI has the potential to reduce poverty and inequality by guaranteeing a minimum income level. It could provide stability to people in precarious situations, reducing dependence on food banks, emergency shelters, and other social services. The defenders believe that this would also improve mental and physical health, since financial stress is one of the main factors contributing to anxiety, depression, and other health problems. They argue that a well-implemented UBI could stimulate economic growth by increasing consumer spending and creating new markets. However, the detractors of the UBI raise serious doubts about its viability and possible disadvantages. One of the most common criticisms is the cost. Providing all citizens with a regular income would require massive public financing, which raises doubts about how it would be funded. Some suggest increasing taxes on businesses and the rich, while others fear that the increase in taxes could discourage investment and economic productivity if not managed adequately. The UBI could cause inflation, since the increase in the purchasing power of citizens would raise the prices of goods and services, negating the plan benefits. Another concern is whether the UBI would disincentivize work. If people receive a guaranteed income regardless of their work situation, would they continue to seek work? Some studies suggest that people would continue working and would use the income as a complement instead of a substitute. Others fear that a part of the population could abandon the labor market completely, which would cause a decrease in productivity and economic stagnation. This raises philosophical questions about the nature of work itself. Should human dignity be tied to work, or is financial security a fundamental right that should exist independently of employment? The effects of the UBI on existing welfare systems are also subject to debate. Would it substitute traditional social programs, or would it function together with them? Some argue that the UBI could rationalize the bureaucracy, eliminating the need for complex welfare programs that require means testing and eligibility criteria. Others warn that a universal lump sum payment might not be enough for people with greater needs, such as people with disabilities or chronic illnesses who depend on specific assistance programs. The experiments with the UBI have yielded disparate results. The pilot programs in Finland, Canada, and Kenya have demonstrated that beneficiaries experience greater financial stability, better mental health, and an increase in entrepreneurial spirit. However, critics argue that short-term trials cannot fully predict the long-term economic effects of a policy at the national level. The debate continues, as more countries are considering carrying out small-scale tests to gather data about its viability. In essence, the debate about universal basic income forces societies to reconsider their fundamental economic structures. Should wealth be distributed in a more equitable way as a means to guarantee stability, or does that redistribution undermine the incentives for innovation and productivity, as automation and economic changes continue redefining the nature of work? The debate around the UBI will continue to be fundamental in discussions about the future of social policy and human welfare. The debate about the ethics of cloning. Should human beings or animals be cloned to obtain benefits? The possibility of cloning previously belonged to the realm of science fiction, but with advances in genetic technology, it has become an urgent ethical question. From the cloning of Dolly the sheep in 1996 to recent advances in genetic editing and artificial reproduction, cloning technology has raised profound questions about identity, autonomy, and the limits of scientific intervention. The debate about the ethics of cloning forces society to confront the possible benefits and dangers of replicating life. The defenders of cloning argue that it offers revolutionary opportunities in medicine, agriculture, and reproductive science. Therapeutic cloning, for example, could revolutionize medicine by means of the cultivation of genetically identical tissues or organs for their transplant, eliminating the risk of rejection and the need for immunosuppressant medications. This technology could also help scientists to study genetic illnesses in controlled environments, which would give rise to new treatments and possible cures. Cloning could also be used in conservation initiatives, helping to preserve species in danger of extinction by means of the generation of genetically identical individuals to reinforce declining populations. Reproductive cloning, that is, the creation of genetically identical human beings, is where ethical concerns intensify. Some see it as a possible solution for infertile couples who wish to have genetically related children, or for people who have lost a loved one and wish to replicate them. However, critics argue that cloning raises profound moral and philosophical questions about individuality and human dignity. Would a cloned person be treated as an independent individual, or would they be considered simply a copy of another person? The psychological and social implications of cloning could be enormous and lead to unforeseen challenges in the formation of identity and personal autonomy. Another important ethical concern revolves around the risks and uncertainties of cloning technology. The cloning of animals has shown high failure rates, with many embryos that do not develop correctly or that lead to serious anomalies. If applied to human beings, these failures would raise significant moral dilemmas. Would it be ethical to create clones knowing that a high percentage could suffer genetic defects or have a shorter life expectancy? Some argue that the mere act of cloning human beings could commodify life, reducing people to biological experiments instead of unique individuals. Beyond individual concerns, cloning raises questions about its social impact. Would widespread cloning alter the natural genetic diversity of the human population? Could it lead to new forms of inequality in which cloned individuals were treated differently based on their genetic origins? The potential for abuse is also significant. The governments or organizations with access to cloning technology could exploit it for unethical purposes, such as the engineering of individuals with specific traits or the mass production of genetically identical human beings for labor or military purposes. Religious and philosophical perspectives add another layer to the debate. Many religious traditions consider cloning an unnatural intervention in human creation, arguing that life should not be replicated artificially. Others view cloning as a way to expand the capacity for human action and scientific progress. The clash between these worldviews makes the issue especially polarizing, as it touches on fundamental beliefs about the sanctity of life and science's role in shaping the future. Legal and regulatory issues further complicate the debate. While many countries have banned human cloning, enforcement and oversight vary greatly. Advances in biotechnology continue to outpace legal frameworks, raising concerns that cloning may develop unchecked in some regions. Should research into cloning be regulated globally? And if so, who decides on the ethical limits? Ultimately, the debate over the ethics of cloning reflects the broader tension between scientific possibility and ethical responsibility. While cloning has immense potential for progress, it also poses serious moral dilemmas that society must address carefully. The challenge is determining how to harness the benefits of cloning technology while safeguarding human dignity, autonomy, and the principles that define ethical science. As research advances, the debate will remain central to discussions about the future of genetics, medicine, and human identity. The controversy over historical monuments, preserve history, or remove offensive symbols from cities and landscapes. The imposing statues and great monuments stand as testimonies to history, commemorating leaders, wars, and crucial moments. However, as society evolves, so does the lens through which we view these historical figures and events. The controversy over historical monuments has become one of the most contentious cultural debates of the modern era, raising fundamental questions about memory, identity, justice, and how history is told. Advocates for preserving historical monuments argue that these structures are important records of the past and claim that removing or altering them erases history instead of engaging with it. For many, these monuments provide a connection to national heritage, allowing societies to reflect on their origins and evolution. The argument is often posed as a question of historical integrity, regardless of whether the figures represented were morally complex or controversial, since their contributions to history are undeniable. However, detractors argue that many monuments glorify people and events associated with oppression, racism, colonialism, and violence. They argue that these statues not only preserve history, but actively shape public memory, often reinforcing narratives that overlook the suffering of marginalized groups. The debate has intensified in recent years with calls for the removal of statues linked to figures associated with slavery, imperialism, and systemic discrimination. One of the most prominent examples of this controversy is the debate over Confederate statues in the United States. Many of these statues, erected during the Jim Crow era and the Civil Rights Movement, are considered symbols of racial injustice rather than historical artifacts. Supporters of their removal argue that these monuments were not simply built to honor the past, but to send a political message of white supremacy and resistance to racial equality. In contrast, Some defenders see them as tributes to Southern heritage and argue that their removal erases an important, albeit painful, chapter of American history. A similar debate unfolded in the United Kingdom around statues of imperialist figures such as Cecil Rhodes and Winston Churchill. The critics argue that Rhodes, architect of British colonialism in Africa, represents a legacy of exploitation and should not be publicly honored. The protests have led to debates about whether figures like Churchill, celebrated for leading Great Britain during World War II, but also criticized for policies that contributed to famine and colonial oppression, should remain unquestionable icons of history. The controversy is not limited to the West. In South Africa, monuments to figures from the apartheid era have been subject to removal, reflecting the nation's reckoning with its past. In India, statues of British colonial rulers have been replaced by others that honor independence leaders, signaling a shift in national identity. Even in Japan and China, disputes over war memorials continue to provoke international tensions, particularly with regard to how different nations remember acts of aggression and victimhood. A crucial aspect of the debate is the question of alternatives. If controversial monuments are removed, what should replace them? Some suggest relocating the statues to museums, where they can be presented with their full historical context, rather than as objects of public veneration. Others propose adding plaques, reinterpretations, or counter-monuments that offer a more nuanced perspective, recognizing both the achievements and failures of historical figures. In addition, new monuments can be erected to honor previously ignored people and communities, ensuring a more inclusive representation of history. From a philosophical point of view, the controversy surrounding historical monuments. Controversy over historical monuments forces us to consider how to balance remembering the past with creating a more just society for the present and the future. Does removing a statue erase history, or does it simply reflect an evolution of morality and justice? Are monuments educational tools, or do they primarily serve as symbols of power and identity? These are difficult questions with no clear answers, and as societies continue to grapple with their history, the fate of controversial monuments will remain a central point in debates about culture, memory, and justice. The problem of censorship on social networks, freedom of expression versus preventing online harm. In an era where digital platforms shape public discourse, the issue of censorship on social media has become one of the most debated ethical dilemmas. Social media companies wield immense power over the flow of information, acting as gatekeepers for billions of users. The problem of censorship on social networks forces society to grapple with complex issues about freedom of expression, misinformation, corporate responsibility, and the influence of private companies on public dialogue. Advocates for moderation on social media argue that it is necessary to curb harmful content, such as hate speech, violent threats, harassment, and misinformation. If left unchecked, these problems can lead to real-world harm, from the spread of extremist ideologies to public health crises fueled by false medical claims. Technology companies claim they have a duty to protect users from harmful content and ensure that online spaces remain safe and inclusive. Algorithms, content moderators, and anti-misinformation policies aim to reduce the spread of harmful rhetoric while preserving public trust. However, critics warned that excessive censorship threatens freedom of expression and allows companies to dictate the limits of what is acceptable. Decisions to remove content or suspend accounts can be inconsistent, politically biased, or influenced by external pressures. Many argue that tech giants like Facebook, X, and YouTube have too much control over public dialogue, acting as arbiters of truth without regulation. The lack of transparency in moderation decisions fuels concerns about whether censorship is applied fairly or selectively internationally. Social media censorship takes on different dimensions in authoritarian regimes. Governments take advantage of social media restrictions to repress dissent and control discourse. China's heavily censored internet, where platforms like Weibo and WeChat operate under strict governmental supervision, contrasts sharply with the freer but moderated landscape of Western platforms and democratic countries. The line between responsible moderation and censorship by governmental influence remains blurred, especially when platforms comply with state demands to remove content considered harmful or false. Another important concern is the role of artificial intelligence in content moderation algorithms, often defective and biased, that struggle to differentiate between legitimate debate and harmful content. As a result, automated systems can mistakenly remove harmless discussions and fail to detect truly harmful material. In addition, content moderation often falls on poorly paid human moderators who are frequently exposed to disturbing material and have little support. The proposed solutions to the dilemma of censorship on social media are very varied. Some advocate for stricter governmental regulation to ensure that technological companies remain responsible and transparent in their moderation decisions. Others push for decentralized platforms that reduce corporate control over digital freedom of expression. Defenders of freedom of expression advocate for more lenient content policies that allow open discourse while guaranteeing security. Security advocates emphasize the need for stricter application to protect vulnerable communities from online abuse. Ultimately, the problem of censorship on social media reflects the constant struggle between security and freedom, regulation and autonomy, public interest and corporate power. The challenge consists of finding a balance that protects users from harm without undermining the principles of open dialogue and freedom of expression. As social media continues to evolve, the debate about censorship will continue to be a determining issue in the digital age. The problem of digital immortality, the idea of living beyond death, has fascinated humanity for centuries, from myths of eternal life to religious concepts of the afterlife. Now, with advances in artificial intelligence and data conservation, digital immortality is no longer a distant fantasy, but a real possibility. The concept consists of preserving a person's consciousness, memories, and personality in digital format, allowing them to exist and interact with the world even after death. However, like all technological innovations that challenge the natural order, digital immortality poses profound ethical, philosophical, and practical dilemmas. One of the main ethical concerns is the issue of consent. Many people leave behind a large amount of digital footprints, emails, social media posts, voice recordings, and biometric data, without giving their explicit consent for their use after death. Should companies, governments, or even family members have a right to create a digital avatar or an AI representation of someone based on their online presence without clear guidelines? Digital immortality could lead to the exploitation of personal data, which would pose privacy problems that extend beyond death. Another dilemma revolves around identity and authenticity. A digital recreation of a person can speak like them, think like them, and even show emotions, but is it really them? Some argue that a digital clone is nothing more than an advanced simulation that lacks the consciousness and subjective experience that define human existence. Others suggest that if an entity powered by artificial intelligence can replicate human thought patterns and personality with near-perfect precision, the distinction between real and artificial consciousness could become irrelevant. This challenges ingrained beliefs about what it means to be human and forces us to consider whether consciousness is exclusively biological or whether it can be replicated digitally. The psychological and social implications of digital immortality are equally complex. For the grieving, interacting with a digital version of a deceased loved one could provide comfort or closure. AI-powered chatbots already allow people to engage in conversations with simulated versions of deceased people based on their past communications. However, prolonged dependence on the digital echoes of the dead could blur the line between mourning and denial, preventing people from fully processing their loss. Would society develop an unhealthy attachment to digital ghosts, making it difficult to accept death as a natural part of life? The commercialization of digital immortality adds another layer of ethical concern. Tech companies could benefit from offering services that recreate deceased loved ones, potentially turning human memory into a product. This raises questions about exploitation. Should people be able to subscribe to digital versions of deceased people? Could this lead to unauthorized recreations of public figures, celebrities, or even ordinary people for commercial or political purposes without strict ethical guidelines? Strict guidelines? Digital immortality could become a tool of manipulation rather than remembrance. From a legal point of view, the issue is largely uncharted territory. Traditional laws governing inheritance, intellectual property, and digital rights do not account for the preservation of AI-driven consciousness. Who owns the rights to a digital replica? Can an AI version of a deceased person sign contracts, generate new works, or have legal capacity? These are questions that legislators will have to address as technology advances, ensuring that digital immortality does not become a legal and ethical minefield. The question also arises as to whether digital immortality should be reserved for a select few. If creating and maintaining AI versions of people is expensive, will only the rich have access to this form of continued existence? This could lead to a new form of inequality, in which only certain people achieve a digital life after death, while others fall into oblivion. Also, if digital avatars can persist indefinitely, what impact might this have on cultural evolution? Would society remain anchored to the perspectives and ideologies of past generations, thus limiting progress and innovation? Ultimately, the problem of digital immortality forces us to confront fundamental questions about the nature of life, death, and identity in the digital age. Should humanity pursue the goal of preserving consciousness indefinitely? Or does death fulfill a vital role in the cycle of human existence? While digital immortality presents exciting possibilities, it also challenges us to consider if we are truly prepared to redefine life and death. We have explored some stimulating ethical dilemmas that challenge our perspectives on morality, society, and the future. Now I would love to know your opinion. Share your ideas in the comments below. If you found these discussions interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe, and hit the bell for more. Thank you for reflecting with me on these complex issues. Your curiosity and participation make these conversations worthy of interest.